CD 4.
Will burst through the door, followed by a stocky man dressed completely in black, limping heavily on his left leg. "Mum!" He flung himself on her lap, and they smothered each other in kisses. "Is the war over? Have you come to take us home?" Gwen saw Bryn and Peggy exchange a worried look. "I've come to visit," she said. "See how you're getting on." A feeling of warmth cloaked her as both children moulded themselves into her, exactly like they used to. She longed to hold on to the sense of calm they gave her, but within a few short minutes she was more aware of the hollow, empty space that was the size and shape of Johnny, and the comfort slipped away. They gabbled on about school, what they did in the country that they couldn't do at home, their teachers' names, the friends they'd made, and the ones they'd fallen out with. Then Ruth remembered her puppy and jumped up. "Come and see Dot," she said, pulling on Gwen's sleeve. "I ain't seen him yet," Will said. "Dot's a girl," Ruth said. "Ain't she, Uncle Bryn?" "She certainly is, my lovely," Bryn answered, turning from the bowl of carrots he was peeling. "She's still in the yard during the day," Peggy said, taking them through the cool flagged pantry. "We'll bring her in soon. Now it's getting colder." The puppy jumped up at them, spinning and licking and burying its head in Ruth's lap. "She's great fun," Will said, stroking the white spot on the dog's black head. "I wish we had one. Me and Marty." "Well, you can come and see Dot any time you like, can't he, Ruth?" Ruth nodded. "I've told him that before," Peggy said, turning to Gwen. "And I've mentioned it to Mrs. Morgan, but—" She rolled her eyes. Gwen looked down at the kids standing side by side, passing the puppy backwards and forwards. Ruth was pristine, so clean that the parting in her hair shone pink. Her clothes looked handmade, but were neat and serviceable, exactly right for playing. She smelled lovely too, like fresh air. And while she wasn't plump, she had a good covering on her that boded well for the winter months ahead. Will was shivering. He was wearing a school jersey, the sleeves 2 inches shy of his wrists, and grey woolen shorts that were stained with ink and gravy. His thin knees were grubby, and Gwen could see black in and behind his ears. She raked her hand through his thick hair, and he winced when it snagged on a knot. Her fingers came away covered in a sticky film. Auntie Peggy had been watching her, and Gwen saw her shudder, either at the dirt or the state of her hands, or both. Gwen squatted between the children and put her arms around them. "Will," she said, "why are you playing in your school clothes?" Will shrugged and threw a rubber ball across the yard. "Fetch, Dot," he said. "Do you have a clean set for tomorrow?" Will raced across the paving slabs to retrieve the ball from the vegetable patch. "No," he said. "Did you bring the socks I asked for, Mum? And the comics?" Gwen laughed. "Yeah," she said. "I did. And a few other bits and bobs." "Now then," Peggy said. "Dinner won't be long." Will stopped, the ball in his hands. His eyes looked huge in his pale face. "It smells good," he said. "I'll put up a plate for you, so you can eat with Mum. If Mrs. Morgan doesn't mind." "She won't care." Will threw the ball to one side. "I'll run and tell her." "Bring your friend back with you," Peggy said. "There's plenty for him." "I think," Gwen said, standing up and straightening her skirt, "I'll walk round with you, Will. I'd like to meet Mr. and Mrs. Morgan myself. Say ta for their kindness." Peggy set her lips again and nodded. For a little while, Will held her hand. Next, he faced her, skipping backwards through narrow lanes and tight alleyways. Then he hugged her and ran ahead, stopping at quite a large stone cottage that seemed to be on the outskirts of the village. "Come round the back," he said, winding his way through an obstacle course of broken machinery. "What does Mr. Morgan do?" Gwen asked. "He fixes things." Gwen didn't think he could be very successful, judging from the rusting harrows and shears lying about. Rapping on the door, Will called out, "Mrs. Morgan, it's me." "Why is he back so soon?" a thick, deep voice called out. "Don't ask me," the woman answered. The door was pulled open by a small woman in a faded tabard that might once have been pink or mauve or blue. Her greying hair was crossed in 2 plaits over her head. Her arms were crossed over her bulging chest, her face set in cross lines. "What now?" Her voice trailed off when she saw Gwen. "How d'you do, Mrs. Morgan?" Gwen said. "I'm Will's mum." By the time Gwen found Marty in the chicken coop that he and Will kept in a cleaner state than the house, and gathered together their things, she was determined to take them back with her to London. Then she began to doubt her decision. She couldn't take Will and not Ruth, but Ruth was happy and well cared for. If only Auntie Peggy could take the boys, but she hadn't the space. As it was, Gwen had to share a tiny bed with Ruth. Susie squeezed in between them. The boys slept on the sitting room floor, more comfortable and warm there than they had ever been with the Morgans. She was desperate for sleep, but instead she lay awake most of the night, sweating about what to do for the best. She was up early, helping to organise the kids for school, washing and scrubbing at Will and Marty, dabbing the worst off their uniforms, cutting their bread, checking their copybooks. They were about to leave when there was a knock at the door. Bryn answered it and came into the kitchen with a telegram for Gwen. He handed it to her and said, "I hope nothing's the matter." Gwen stared at it for a minute. It might be all right. It wasn't bordered in black. She tore it open. "Do not bring kids home. Stop. Betty needs you here. Stop. George. Stop." "It's from Dad," Gwen said. "He wants to make sure I give you a hug from him." She kissed them both and ruffled Marty's hair. Surely George would understand if she went against his wishes and took them home with her. He wasn't a cruel man. But he would insist they be sent elsewhere, Cornwall, Scotland, Norfolk. They would be separated from their friends and the school they'd settled into, and instead of billeting with an Auntie Peggy, they might both get a Mrs. Morgan, or worse. She made up her mind to get Will and Marty moved and be firm about it. She wouldn't take no for an answer. "Good for you, Mrs. Gregson," Peggy said. "I'll take you to Jenkins myself." For a moment Gwen was puzzled. Then she said, "He's the billeting officer, ain't he?" Peggy nodded and marched her through the rain-slick streets, oblivious to the incessant downpour. On the way, she untethered her opinion of Mrs. Morgan, who, she said, let Wales down with her slapdash approach. "Trouble is," she said, "we have been pushed here. That's no excuse, I know. But every available bed has been taken, and at least the boys have been safe from the bombing." "That's what George would say." Peggy looked at her from under the plaid shawl covering her hair. "But you're not sure?" "I used to think," Gwen hesitated, surprised by how easily she was talking, "they could only ever be safe with me. Now I know different." Peggy took her arm and squeezed it. "I think you're doing a grand job," she said. By Tuesday bedtime, Will and Marty were ensconced with the Gwilts in their smart cottage near the town green. The two little ones who'd billeted with them had gone to stay with relatives in Hertfordshire, so they were delighted with the prospect of having a couple of boys around the place. Gwen left them in the warm kitchen, sitting shyly on benches at the scrub table, waiting for Mr. Gwilt to come home so they could have their tea. She spent one last evening with Ruth, reading to her, brushing her hair, tucking her up. "I'll see you soon," she said, turning down the wick in the oil lamp. She said the same thing to Will, and hoped that was the case, although she was glad neither of them asked her to promise. She and the other London mum talked a bit on the journey home, but for most of the way Gwen watched the darkening sky, reminded that in another month it would be Christmas, and soon after, a year since that terrible night. She mulled over everything that had happened during the previous few days, satisfied that she'd made the best decision she could for Will and Ruth under the circumstances. She felt different, as if she'd done something she could congratulate herself about, as if she might start to trust herself again. Perhaps. Betty was scrubbing pans at the sink when Gwen dragged herself into the kitchen. "Gwen," she said, drying her hands on her apron and taking the case, "you look done in. Are the kids all right?" "They are now," she said. "I've sorted things out. First things first, let me get you a bit of toast and tea, and you get yourself warm." She made to help Gwen off with her coat, but Gwen pulled her arms free of the sleeves by herself. "It's okay, Bet," she said, trying to avoid the guilty feeling she'd had last week, when she realised that she wasn't as good to Betty as Betty was to her. You've enough to do. How's Annie? She had a scare when she read something about Ray's battalion. But Betty raised her hands, then let them drop. Hope so, she said. Don't say that, Betty. They looked away from each other, both of them determined not to set the other off. Let me cut some bread, Betty said. I'll have a bit with you. By the way, before I forget, someone named Evelyn called round for you. Lovely girl. What did she want? Not sure, really. To see when you were going to be back to work, I think. I'd spoken to the gaffer about the time off. Anyway, we had a good chat. She stopped for a while. Well, she'd come quite a way. What did you talk about? Usual things. The war, the weather. She talked about dancing. I showed her photos of the kids. She feels for you. You're lucky to work with someone so nice. Gwen nodded. Yeah, she said. I am. Now she would have to tell Evelyn the whole story, something she'd been avoiding. She put her fingers in her mouth and started to nibble, something she hadn't done the whole time she was in Wales. Chapter 6. December 1941 to March 1942. Joan. For ages, Alice had been promising Joan a place in the large end of terrace house where she roomed. Hazel's hostel, Alice called it. Alice had taken Joan to meet Hazel, who let her spare bedrooms out to single girls working in London. After a couple of wedding dates were cancelled due to suspension of all leave, one of the girls was at last able to get married and vacated her musty but clean and polished room, in which Joan now stood, suitcase in hand. The life had been beaten out of the square of fringed rug, diminishing rather than reviving its pattern. The floorboards around the faded carpet buffed with a good inch of beeswax. There was a funny old-fashioned tallboy in one corner freshly painted in a muddy shade of green, the leftover paint used on the frame of the mirror that stood on top. Extra blankets were doubled over on the bottom of the bed, the turned and stitched bedsheet folded across plump pillows. On the wall, a group of smartly dressed picnickers, framed in dark wood, smiled out from their mat on the sand. Joan opened the embossed doors of the heavy wardrobe that dominated the room and hung the few things she brought with her. A navy coat, a black skirt, one white and one fawn blouse, a black jacket, 2 work shirts, dungarees. In the bottom of the wardrobe, she lined up her work boots, lace-ups and black heels. Undergarments and nightclothes went in the drawers that didn't stick. Book, notepad, pencil on the bedside table, soap, hairpins, lipstick, powder on the tallboy. It was a miserable day, cold and dreary. No sign of snow yet, and not much rain, unlike this time last year. Joan unlatched the window and pushed up the sash. The garden was as well organised as the house. Stepping stones led to a vegetable plot along the back wall, resting and waiting for spring. A patch of grass was marked out on both sides of the path, brown shrubs and trees with bare branches around the perimeter. Surveying the room once more, she lay on the bed and closed her eyes. Relief overwhelmed her. She had managed to get out 3 weeks before Mother could mark the year since that frightful episode with her sighing, her frequent hurt looks, and her nagging about Joan wasting time and talent on that horrid bridge. Turning on her side, she drew up her knees to her chest. An image of Ralph came into her mind, as it did many times every day. She missed him. It was almost unbearable at times, her yearning for his animal warmth and smell, the feel of his hands skimming over her, grabbing onto her hips, her breasts and thighs, each grasp tighter and firmer than the last, opening herself to his thrusts and grunts. She had persisted in telling herself that she didn't long for him and tried to make herself admit that she hadn't really known him at all. But none of those ploys worked. She turned on her back and stared at the papered ceiling. So what was it, she wondered for the umpteenth time, that she'd found attractive about Ralph, other than the idea that he wanted her, which she had to admit was not a force easy to dismiss. She imagined Colin or Edward's eyes looking at her, heavy with lust, their hands roaming her flesh, and she laughed out loud. They could not have ignited the same reactions in her by very dint of their lack of bearing and authority. Those were some of the qualities that had attracted her to Ralph, along with the way he walked, talked, conducted himself, helped her on with her coat and off with her petticoat. His knowledge of politics, food and good wines, the habits he cultivated, like coffee and the Financial Times at 11. His deep-seated love of culture and all things cultured, the ardent way he had once or twice corrected the position of her elbow or the slant of her bow. And, she told herself, above everything else, it had been the knowledge that Mother would have found him the epitome of unsuitability. Climbing out of bed, Joan closed the window, then slipped in between the cold sheet and eiderdown. She pressed her hands between her knees to warm them. She had longed for the time and quiet to think and consider. But now that she had it, she was working hard at keeping her most troublesome thoughts at bay. Waves of heat followed the cold, but the truth was she had derived a huge amount of pleasure and satisfaction from knowing that Mother would be disgusted with her choice of man and what she was doing with him. She wondered if spite was a recognised catalyst for passion. There was also the light-headed nascent hopefulness that short period of time had embodied as a possible escape route from Mother, who had been the reason for her wanton behaviour and the cause of all the heartache she had experienced. Had it been worth the pain, the loneliness, the rejection and humiliation she felt? "Yes," she whispered to the happy, innocent young people sipping wine and eating sandwiches in the picture above the chest of drawers. "It's very sad, but the answer is yes." She flared her nostrils and took in the chilly air of the simple, unheated room, and she thought, I would do it again if it meant I could make Mother understand that I would no longer allow her to have control over me, and if it meant I could have Ralph back again. Then she sank into a pillow and felt a familiar sense of defeat. Whenever she thought she had stoked her determination to the point of iron fortitude, the tiniest bit of compassion, or perhaps it was tenderness for Mother, crept into her thoughts and unnerved her. That was the dilemma, and back and forth it went in a repetitive pattern. It had to be stopped, and to do that, Joan knew she had to be strong-willed and rigid in her approach. She reminded herself of the scene with Mother when she said she was leaving, and recalling it, Joan felt she was justified. Moving, then. Leaving sounded so final. It will be easier for work. Mother's jaw fell. You couldn't have an easier journey to Waterloo. It gets messy sometimes with shifts. You're being pernicious and it doesn't suit you. Mother looked around the house in astonishment. How could you leave this for a shabby little room somewhere? It isn't shabby, Mother, Joan said, collecting together what she could carry. Mother followed her around, whimpering and pleading. At least wait until Christmas. Joan shook her head. I don't want to lose the place. After everything you've lost, you're worried about a bedsit. Joan made it to the door without saying anything she would regret. Grabbing a pencil and notepad, Mother said, Leave me your address, Joan dear. Please. Joan hesitated. She didn't want to be cruel. She scribbled on the paper. The street isn't difficult to find, but the house is tucked right up in the corner. A bit isolated, even though it's just off Streatham High Road. Mother looked as though she was in shock. When Joan kissed her cheek and turned away, she was taken aback to find tears on her own face. She wiped at them hard with the heel of her hand. She couldn't, after all, have stood it for a day longer. There was a light rap on the door, the nervous clearing of a throat. Have you settled in, sweetheart? Joan stood up, straightening her skirt and smoothing her hair. Come in, Miss Talbot. A woman of about 50 took a couple of steps into the room, as if she thought her presence might cause offence. She was very fair, although there was a good scattering of white amongst the pale gold hair that was caught up in a low twist at the nape of her neck. Her skin was almost translucent, and every part of it on show. Hands, wrists, face, neck, was covered in a faint wash of freckles, as if she'd been spattered with tan-coloured paint. She was heavy, but moved with light, determined steps, always occupied, always busy. Feathery lines surrounded her mouth and grey eyes, especially when she smiled, like she did now. Joan thought she must have been lovely when she was younger. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" Her voice sounded forced and formal. "It's perfect. I'm sure it's not, but I'm glad it suits for now. You'll let me know if you need anything?" Joan nodded. "Thank you. Don't forget, you can help yourself to tea and biscuits if rations allow." "What shall I do about my own rations?" Joan looked around and encompassed the room with a sweep of her arm. "I don't want to keep food up here." "Oh no, sweetheart. I'll give you a cupboard in the kitchen. Then you must feel free to do for yourself." She waved for Joan to follow her. "Or I'll cook for you along with the others if you leave out the rations you want me to use. I'll show you." The kitchen was another room as worn by time and vigorous cleaning as the rest of the house. The last glimmer of watery winter sun shone through the spotless windows and fell on the scrubbed wooden table. Joan had thought Mother was house-proud, but not even she could have faulted Hazel's housekeeping, although she would no doubt criticise the lack of ornament. Mother was much prissier in her tastes than Hazel. "This is your cupboard." Hazel stretched on her toes to reach above the sink. "I've washed it out. Not that Mary left it dirty, you understand." "I could have done that, Miss Talbot, but thank you. I do appreciate it." "You must call me Hazel. Everyone does. And this," she indicated a small pile of food on the end of the sideboard, "is where you can leave the things you can't use. I'll make a jam tart with the flour and egg and mix the bully beef with some mash and a bit of onion. Then I'll leave it for any of you who's passing and hungry." "That's awfully nice of you." "Well, we can't have food going to waste, can we?" Hazel said, sounding less diffident now. "That wouldn't do." Furrows appeared in Hazel's forehead as she studied Joan for a moment. She felt sure Hazel wanted to say something more to her, inquire about some aspect of her demeanour. Probably the way she spoke or held herself. She was out of place on the bridge, or in this type of accommodation. Whatever is a girl like her doing here? Why ever is she working there? Joan knew that was what people were wondering. She also knew that the war made it difficult to ask too many questions. Anything was possible now, but people were still fascinated by the improbable. Thank goodness for Alice and her Bristolian dialect, much more puzzling and comment-provoking than her own plummy diction. Hazel looked away, as if aware she'd been caught staring, and started to fill the kettle. "Would you like a nice cuppa?" she said. "Have it with me and Mummy in the parlour. There's to be a special announcement on the wireless from Churchill." During her initial visit, Joan had been introduced to Hazel's mother, Ivy, who had been propped up in an overstuffed chair, blankets around her legs, dribbling from her drooping mouth onto a muslin cloth tucked under her chin. The sight had appalled her. Hazel was the last word in patience with her, so kind and thoughtful. If it ever came to it, Joan knew she couldn't care for Mother in the same way, if at all. "Perhaps I'll go back upstairs. Tidy my things. Alice shouldn't be long. Then we might go to the pictures." Hazel looked let down. "Of course, sweetheart. Come and go as you please. But you'd be very welcome. Mummy loves company." "All right then. Thank you." Joan thought she ought to try to get used to Ivy. "If you're sure it's not any trouble." Averting her eyes, Joan threaded her way between the sideboard and footstool and around Ivy's bed to place the tray she carried on a small table next to Ivy's chair. Then she made for a seat out of Ivy's line of vision. "Look, Mummy," Hazel pronounced every word with precision. "It's Joan, our new girl. She's come to have tea with us. Isn't that lovely?" "Hello, Mrs. Talbot. I'm very pleased to see you again." Hazel beckoned for Joan to move closer. "Bring your chair up here so Mummy can see and hear you," Hazel said. "She's very taken with you." Joan wondered how Hazel knew that, as there had been no reaction from Ivy. Not a flutter of a finger in greeting or the slightest inclination of her head. Joan did as she was asked, though, and drew alongside Ivy, slight and squashed in the folds of the huge chair. Hazel perched in front of her mother, daintily putting the teacup to the tremulous lips, breaking off minute pieces of eggless, fatless sultana cake for Ivy to savour. A scuffed wicker basket overflowing with knitting pins and wool nestled next to the fireplace. When Joan first met her, Hazel had been wearing a lemon cardigan with a yellow brooch pinned to it. Today the combination was baby pink. Alice said that Hazel spent every evening sitting with her mother knitting and had a whole wardrobe of pastel knitwear. "She gives one to me," Alice had said, "but it were too tight, so I gives it back." Joan supposed that having someone else to talk to was a change for both of them. Not that she was doing much of that. "This is Mummy's favourite," Hazel said. "Isn't it, Mummy? Mind you, she was always partial to a bit of cake. Never mind what was or wasn't in it. Isn't that right, Mummy?" Joan was amazed at how Hazel kept up the banter, as if Ivy was aware of what was being said and was able to join in the conversation. Although when Hazel moved or turned to Joan, Ivy's dull eyes followed her daughter around the room, like the eyes of the Mona Lisa she'd read about in an art journal. "Another cup, Joan?" Hazel asked, wiping Ivy's mouth. "One's plenty, thank you." "And one's enough for you this late in the afternoon?" Hazel addressed her mother. "Is that the time? Let's tune the wireless. I'm afraid we've missed it today, Mummy. She does so like it's that man again. Well, we both do. Do you listen to it?" Joan had heard it once or twice when Mother was out, as she'd never allow it, but she'd found the humour difficult to follow. It was very popular. Everyone on the bridge talked about it, so she was able to offer a catchphrase. She lowered her voice to sound like Jack Train. "Don't mind if I do." Hazel laughed. "She's got it off pat, hasn't she, Mummy?" "I should have said that when you asked if I wanted a cup of tea." "Oh, what's that other one I love? Oh, yes." Hazel's face twitched with mischief. "Can I do you now, sir?" Joan knew the character who said that, Mrs. Mop, and she speculated on how apt the idiom was for Hazel. Hazel played with the tuner until they heard the chimes of Big Ben. A grave voice announced the Prime Minister, and Joan sat forward on her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She imagined the entire nation, like her, still and waiting. Churchill's comforting voice broke through the crepitations. He told them about Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and the emergency summoning of Parliament. Joan took solace in the fact that Churchill said Parliament had responded quickly to attend to their duties, even though they were given short notice. She looked at Hazel from the corner of her eye and hoped she was thinking the same thing. A few of Mother's friends had commented, after he was appointed, that Churchill spoke as if he were reciting poetry. Joan could see their point, but said his speeches were more musical than anything, and Mother had agreed. During one of their white flag moments, they had listened together for the staccato breaks, the cadences, the musical phrases, and congratulated themselves on their observations. She took note of them now, seeing before her the oration transposed into a musical score, and wondered if Mother was doing the same. Churchill was now reminding them of Britain's pledge, that if the United States were to declare war on Japan, a British declaration to the same effect would follow promptly. "I don't remember that, Mummy. Do you?" Hazel looked puzzled. "When was that? Joan?" "I'm sure I haven't a clue," said Joan. Hazel was solemn, and, out of respect, Joan was loath to do anything but mirror the look on her face. Then, as if by agreement, they both started to giggle. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I can't keep up sometimes. It's all terribly complicated. The war was enough for us. Who'd ever have thought it would all start up again so soon?" She sighed, and her face became sombre again. Alice had told her that Hazel often talked about the war, meaning the Great War, and that sometimes it was difficult to get away from her once she started reminiscing. Together, they once again gave their full attention to Churchill, He had made a transatlantic telephone call to President Roosevelt to discuss the timing of their respective declarations, but had learned soon after that the Japanese had also attacked British territory in Malaya. Then he went on in detail about something complicated to do with the Japanese High Command and the Imperial Japanese government, the gist of which seemed to be that the United States and Britain were now at war with Japan. In fact, the Cabinet had not waited for the American Congress and had decided to declare war on Japan immediately. Hazel pressed a hand over her heart. "Oh dear," she said. "It sounds very bad." "Yes," Joan agreed. "I'm afraid it is. Not just Germany, now Japan too." With a small scrape, the door opened, and Alice tiptoed in. "Alice!" Hazel jumped up to greet her. "Shh!" Alice put her finger to her mouth and pointed to the wireless. "You've heard then?" Joan and Hazel nodded. Then Churchill told them that diplomatic relations with Japan had come to an end, which meant the British ambassador and his staff in Tokyo were being recalled, and expulsion of the Japanese ambassador from London was underway. The PM's voice trailed off and was lost in a crackle that sounded like distant thunder. Hazel fiddled with the knob, but couldn't retrieve the signal, so clicked off. Alice kissed Ivy's head with genuine affection, and Joan could see why she was such a favourite. "Sorry I were late," Alice said, the attack on Pearl Harbor soon forgotten. "We'll go to the pictures another night this week, all right?" "Of course. No need to worry." "Is your room proper? Come and show me." Joan thanked Hazel for the evening and followed Alice, who went racing ahead, her unruly wavy hair working loose from precarious pins. The parlour door was closed behind them, and Joan heard Hazel take up her sing-song commentary again. That and the muffled click of knitting needles. Mother wrote a clipped note asking Joan to spend Christmas Day with her and Father. Joan replied that she had already accepted an invitation from her landlady, sure the occasion would be jollier with Hazel than it would be at home. On the day, Alice carried Ivy into the kitchen, and they sat around the table, 4 of them, with the addition of another lodger named Ethel, who worked as a pool typist for the War Office, but was waiting to join the ATS. Alice was a big girl, rounded and fleshy, but Joan thought there was nothing soft about Ethel's large frame, flat features, square shoulders leading to a thick waist, with blunt manners to match. "This is handsome," Ethel said. She'd slurped her way through 2 bowls of potato and watercress soup and was attacking the chicken that Hazel had bartered for with a neighbour. In return, Hazel had given up a saucepan full of carrots and sprouts from the garden, the last of which sat on their plates swamped in gravy. There were 2 dishes of potatoes in the middle of the table, one roasted, the other mashed with parsnip. Suet plum duff was steaming on the stove. Paper crowns cut from old newspapers perched on their heads. Joan and Alice waited for Hazel to take her place next to Ivy, but Ethel ploughed ahead. "You're a marvel with the rations," she said, talking with a full mouth. "It's a wonder you never married." "And it will be a miracle if you ever do," Joan thought. What a topic of conversation for Christmas dinner. Hazel must have been surprised by the remark, perhaps as embarrassed as Joan was for her. But she didn't falter in her usual mealtime rhythm. A forkful for Ivy, wipe Ivy's chin, a mouthful for herself. "I would have liked to, but it was all over for me after the war, sweetheart." Ethel pulled a face, squashing her nose and flaring her nostrils. "The war," she mouthed behind Hazel's back. "You know, the Great War." Joan was interested now, wanting to hear more but afraid to ask when Alice looked so despondent, fixing a sprout to her fork with a morsel of stuffing. With a bit of luck, the fingers of sherry that Hazel refilled for them should help Ethel to blunder on, asking the questions that Joan didn't dare. "Did you lose anybody?" Hazel nodded as she held the sticky liquid to Ivy's lips. "Daddy and 2 of my brothers never came back. Nor did Eric, or the boys down the road." "Who was Eric?" "Mine tended. I watched him go. Watched all of them go." She motioned towards the high street beyond the door. "Marched down the road they did. horses and carts in tow. Everyone was cheering them on, waving little flags and tankies in the air, calling out the names of their husbands or brothers. No one imagined we'd never see them again. I jumped up and down, flapping my gloves when Eric marched past. He turned in my direction, and to this day I swear he winked. He could be a one. Then it was as if, as soon as they were out of view, the marching column simply disappeared, line by line, never to be seen again. Hazel's retelling was so vivid that when she stopped, staring into the distance, Joan felt as if she was there amongst the crowd. "Blimey," Ethel said. "So you've carried a torch for him all these years?" "I would have married someone else, but no one came calling for me again. My sister was lucky, being that bit younger. She got her husband and children, but there was nobody left for me." The afternoon was darkening. The garden, through the kitchen window, was obscured by shadows. The 5 women sat still in the gloom, the atmosphere thick with the biding of time. "Let's have pudding," Hazel jumped up. "And another drink if I can squeeze one out." Joan and Alice stacked plates and took them to the sink. "Take your chances while you can, that's what I say," Ethel said. Alice rolled her eyes, a spot of annoyed colour on each cheek. She must be thinking the same as me, Joan thought. Ethel would be more than lucky to get one chance. But had Ralph been Joan's only opportunity at the life that had eluded Hazel? "Let me show you something." Hazel went into the parlour and came back carrying a small blue box. "I thought I would burst when Eric's mum gave this to me. To think, Eric must have told her we were sweethearts." She passed the medal around, and when Joan took it, she read aloud the inscription on the reverse. 1914 to 1918. The Great War for Civilization. "So called," Hazel said. "Not that you'd know it, now. I mean, what did all those boys die for? And Daddy? We've asked ourselves that over and over, haven't we, Mummy?" She shook her head. "I doubt if any of those men would recognise this as the civilization they fought for in France. That's why we don't shed a single tear now, do we, Mummy? We've cried ourselves dry." There was a truce that night, but they drew the blackouts all the same, as did everyone else. Only a fool would trust Hitler. Joan washed, and Alice dried. Then they played a few rounds of put-take, with buttons for currency, and wrung the sherry bottle dry. By the middle of February, it seemed as though they would be able to reach out and touch the women working on the other side of the bridge. The spans being concreted on either side were the last, and when the precast middle piece was lowered into place, the 2 sides would meet. It was coming together like a symphony, each section doing their ordinary, tedious little bit to create one solid, extraordinary piece of work. Joan worried that the pieces might not fit. An orchestra rehearsed time and again if a part wasn't right. But what would happen if the 2 sides didn't align? Would some or all of the building work have to be demolished and started again? She had no idea. But none of the supervisors seemed worried, so perhaps she shouldn't be either. A group of women hung around as close to the edge as they dared, trying to get the attention of their friends on the other side. A risky thing to do, as they were still jumpy after a woman had slipped and drowned last week. That was the 11th gone the same way. Setting down her wheelbarrow, Joan motioned to Alice to have a look. "Not me," Alice said. "Nor me," Joan agreed. They stood to the side of the baying women, clinging on to each other as they gawped over the gap. A gauze of mist whipped across the river, the dirty water beneath it cold and forbidding. "Ladies, ladies," Jim bustled out of his hut that served as an office. "Please," he put his hands on his hips, "come away from there." The crowd dispersed and took up their tools again. "Joan," he said, "come with me a minute, would you?" Alice put down her shovel and made to follow. "You carry on here, Alice," he said. "Joan won't be a minute." Binders with uninspiring titles like testing shearing force and concrete fatigue lined the shelves surrounding Jim's desk. Account books and an alphabetical list of employees stood next to them. Pinned to the walls and laying across a wooden table were blueprints, charts and drawings. "This is Mr. Ware." Jim gestured toward a middle-aged man in a dark suit and tie who stood up and shook Joan's hand. "Mr. Ware, Miss Abbott." "How do you do?" Joan said, momentarily unnerved at being in such close proximity to a man who was about the same age and height as Ralph. He had his bearing too, but a less elegant way of dressing to flaunt his station in life. "Please, sit here." Mr. Ware dusted the seat of his chair with a cambric blue handkerchief. Jim stood at the window for a minute, surveying the workforce before joining them. "We're gathering a group of ladies together to train on the cranes. Thought you might be interested, Joan." The crane cabs were a male domain. The men who worked them were paid more, and everyone thought they were a cut above, or maybe it was the men who created that aura for themselves. "Aren't those positions filled already?" Joan asked, bemused by the situation. "The men are joining up and we can't replace them." His sigh was almost inaudible. "The decision's been made to promote a few women." "Hand-picked," Mr. Ware smiled at her. "You're well thought of." Joan had often thought it would be exhilarating to operate one of the cranes that hovered above them. And after playing in an orchestra, the concentration and responsibility needed wouldn't be onerous. "I'd like that very much. Thank you for asking me," she said. "Monday morning start, then," Mr. Ware said. "I'll see you on the South Pier." "Excuse me?" Joan didn't understand where Mr. Ware fitted in. "I'm so sorry," Jim said. "Apologies. Mr. Ware's the instructor." The two men stood to signal the end of the interview, but Joan hesitated. "What about Alice?" she asked. "Not this time," Jim said. "But we could shift her to Banksman." He shook his head. "Sorry, Bankswoman. You know, crane driver's mate." Joan bit her lip. "Yes, that would be good. Can I tell her?" "Of course." Jim looked weary as he opened the door for her. Joan supposed he'd never had that sort of request from a man. Joan and Alice sang the theme song for Woman of the Year all the way home from the Gaumont Palace. Joan was Alan, Alice was Flanagan. Hazel would get a rendition when they got in. She'd loved that. They'd asked her to go to the pictures with them a number of times, but she wouldn't leave Ivy, not even when her sister was visiting. Hazel met them in the hall, her eyes bright and glistening, her hands fluttering. "Oh, what a shame," she said. "You've only just missed her, sweetheart." "Who?" Joan asked, unable to prevent an image of Ralph's wife appearing in her mind. "Didn't you see her? You must have passed each other within inches." "Hazel, who are you talking about?" "Your mother. Such a well-turned-out woman. You're the image." "Whose mother?" "It weren't mine," Alice said. "Not from that description." "She brought something for you. Mummy's keeping her eye on it." From where Hazel had positioned the violin case, resting against the wall next to the knitting, it did indeed look as if Ivy was watching over it. But when Hazel passed it to Joan, Ivy's lacklustre stare remained glued to the empty space. Alice sucked in her breath. "I didn't know you played the fiddle." "Violin," Joan said. She stood clutching the case, knowing they were watching, waiting for her to say something that would reveal more than she wanted to give away. "You never said," Alice persisted. "I'd have said." "I'm not much good, really." Joan felt she had to offer some explanation. "Besides, there's not much call for it. You know, on the bridge. I'll take it upstairs." "Can't we have a peek?" Hazel asked. Kneeling on the floor, Joan opened the lid. The strings, taut over the ebony fingerboard, were new. Mother must have changed them. She'd probably tuned it too. The varnished gradations of wood shone as if ready for the spotlight to be turned on them. A piece of rosin wrapped in cloth, nestled next to the bow. "I don't think you was telling the whole truth," Alice said. "You must be good to have something so proper. Even I know that." "You haven't told me everything about yourself either," Joan thought. "In fact, I hardly know anything about you. Only what you want to tell me about your nagging mum and the dad who drinks too much. What do any of us know about each other but what we choose to tell? Even that poor woman Gwen with the bitter nails who runs and hides from everyone. What do we know about her?" Hazel reached out and stroked the polished curves and intricate scroll. "Play for us, please. Mummy so enjoys a lovely tune." Joan secured the clasps on the case and stood up. "I don't play any longer," she said. "Oh, but surely—" Joan cut Hazel off. "Did Mother leave a note?" "No, my sweetheart, but she said she'd write." "Thank you, Hazel. Good night, everyone." Bracing herself to kick the violin under her bed, Joan stopped short of her toe making contact with the lower end of the case. Instead, she pushed it decisively with both hands to where it was hidden from view by the mattress, and to where she hoped to be able to forget about its existence entirely. The 3 weeks' training had been intense. They had learned which levers worked the slewing unit that housed the mechanism allowing the crane to rotate, how to watch the back end as well as the front, how a bell in the cab rang if the load was too far forward, the gears that controlled the horizontal jib and lowered the hook to catch or disgorge its prey. Operating the welding equipment had been different. They dared not look to the left or right, but had to stare intently at what they were doing until the electrode ran its course and needed to be changed. Vibrating the concrete was a matter of too little concentration, although it had to be finished to a satisfactory standard before the concrete started to set. On the cranes, it was a case of checking and double-checking every manoeuvre they made, both in the cab and out. They were taught to move deliberately, with studied patience. Each hand on a lever, Joan would focus all her attention on every movement, then survey the surrounding area from the small front and side windows. Of course, when she was fully qualified, she would also have to watch and rely on her bankswoman, Alice, to communicate with her from outside. During these last couple of training days, there would be a series of tasks to ensure the women were adroit enough to work the cranes on the bridge. Standing in a line, they were taking it in turns to watch each other pick up a bucket of sand, negotiate it through an obstacle course of red conical markers, and place it down on a white cross painted on the concrete. Cyril and Jim would also be noting down whether or not the proper procedures had been carried out in the cab before and after the lift. When it was over, they would probably all go for a drink together, as they had a few times. On one occasion, as he was going that way, Cyril walked her to the bus stop and asked her to make a date to meet him. They could go to a tea dance, or for a walk, anything she liked. She remained businesslike and held her chin at a high angle. "That would lack propriety," she said, "given that you're our instructor." "No one need know." He'd put his hands on her shoulders and bobbed low to look in her eyes. He had a way about him that she liked, easy with himself and everything around him. His light brown hair and moustache were flecked with grey, his eyes never losing their boyish delight. She felt the same rush of mystified attraction she'd experienced with Ralph, followed in an instant by the picture of Mother's face if she knew about Joan's predilection. She shook her head. "This training is a good opportunity, and I'm taking it very seriously. I don't want to be bothered by distractions."
"Aha," Cyril smiled. "From that I take it you'll agree to meet when the training's complete."
"Let's talk about it then," she said, flagging down her bus. From then on, Cyril seemed to take it for granted that something would start up between them when the time was right. Last week, out of sight of the others, he'd given her a tablet of sweet-smelling soap that she put next to the sink in the rooming house. That morning, he'd let his hand linger for a beat between her breasts as he slipped a tiny packet of sugar into her bib pocket. She shared it later with Alice and Hazel, who stirred half a teaspoon of the precious grains into Ivy's tea. They didn't ask her where the little treats were coming from. For all they knew, they might be with the compliments of one of the many Americans swarming around the place. Only last weekend, one of them had thrown his arm around a beetroot-faced Alice as a group of them bumped into her and Joan face on in Piccadilly Circus. She in turn didn't question Cyril. They might have been his own rations he was foregoing, or they might be extras he managed to procure. If that was the case, Mother would have found the situation the height of bad taste. But that, and the fact he was so like Ralph in some respects, made it all the more enticing for her. Chapter 7. April to July, 1942. Evelyn. Alec took all his leave in London. Initially, he billeted in the Sally Army Servicemen's Hostel in Southampton Row, but it didn't take him long to ingratiate himself with Dad to the extent that he bedded down on the sitting-room floor, a huge bear in a khaki drawstring den.
"No, sir," he said, when Dad told him to kip on the couch. "Don't spoil me too much. I might get used to it."
Dad never said, "Call me Charlie." The respectful epithet Alec afforded him gave him too much pleasure for that. As a wind-up, Evelyn and Sylvie started addressing Dad as Sir, and now slipped easily between the two monikers. Dad beamed when he took Alec, smart in battle blouson, a maple leaf insignia pinned on his cap, to the pub for a pint. He saved cuttings from the paper and made a list of points he'd heard on the radio to discuss with Alec. Sometimes Uncle Bert joined them too. Evelyn wondered that Sylvie didn't get impatient to have him to herself, but him being there seemed to be enough to satisfy her, and they did always manage to find some time to be together. That afternoon, they were talking about the Baedeker raids. Sylvie moved to and fro with tea and morsels of food she'd been saving her rations to buy. Alec never arrived empty-handed either, bringing a small packet of biscuits, a square of chocolate or cocoa powder in a twist of wax paper. Alec let Sylvie hand the cups and plates around, saying a thank you to her that was much lengthier than necessary, his fingers grazing hers and holding her back with a long, deep look until they ended up grinning at each other. But, Evelyn noticed, he would not let her clear up after him. He insisted on piling up as much crockery as he could carry and taking it into the kitchen, where Evelyn could hear him talking and laughing with Sylvie. Sometimes he rolled his sleeves back and washed up, as if it was an ordinary everyday occurrence. Perhaps that's how things happened in Canada, but Ron had never done anything like that. Evelyn was impressed. That's the way it should be, she thought. No silly grievances about who does what, more getting on with things together. Looking in from the kitchen door, Sylvie said, "Are you coming out with us tonight, Evelyn?" "Where to?" "The Paramount." Evelyn knew the place on Tottenham Court Road, a favourite haunt of the Canucks. It was a lively place, almost too small to contain the full-bodied laughter and high spirits that filled it. If it wasn't for the uniforms, you could almost forget there was a war going on. She hesitated, hearing the music and recalling the party atmosphere. She knew she would kick herself later, but said, "I promised Gwen I'd spend a couple of hours with her." She saw Dad, Sylvie and Alec exchange a glance. Her husband's on nights and her friends visiting her daughter-in-law. Sylvie put a hand on her hip, emphasising her slim waist for Alec's attention. "You'd be better off coming with us," she said. "You spend every day with Gwen at work, and she's still an old misery." Although that was the truth, Evelyn hated to hear it. "And so might you be," she retorted. Evelyn waited for remorse to hit Sylvie. When her sister's face dropped, she carried on. "She's better, getting better anyway, and I don't mind keeping her company."
"It's thoughtful of you, love," Dad said. "We just don't want you to miss out." "Yeah."
Alec felt comfortable enough to add his penny's worth.
"You always have a great time at the club. You've got to have some fun too."
Sylvie nodded. "I don't want to see you back in that rut." "No fear of that," Evelyn said, making her way to the side door. "You'll be stuck in a pothole long before me, the way things are going." Chuckling, Alec said,
"If I have my way."
"You cheeky mare," Sylvie said, throwing a tea towel at Evelyn. "Get out of here," she yelled, "and make sure we see you later." "You probably will, so save me a seat." though I don't plan to sit down much. Sometimes Evelyn's heart sank when Gwen asked her to visit. For one thing, it was a trek to Cubitt Town. Tube to King's Cross, change for Whitechapel, walk through to Limehouse for the number 56 to Stebondale Street. For another, Sylvie was right in supposing the evenings there were less than thrilling. Evelyn had never actually said that, always sticking up for Gwen. But Sylvie and Dad had made up their own minds on the 2 occasions Evelyn had asked Gwen back to Wood Green. Neither visit had gone well. Gwen had seemed overwhelmed by the chat flying backwards and forwards, and couldn't muster much to say about anything that was brought up in conversation, not even the bridge. Dad and Alec, who'd been there one of those times, were charming to her, but she sat on the edge of her chair, struggling painfully to keep her fingers away from her mouth. Of course, Gwen knew Sylvie, but that didn't help the situation either. "What do you think of the dinners in the canteen, Gwen?" Sylvie had asked. "It's something hot," Gwen answered, shrugging. "Were you there when Olive took hers back and complained?" Gwen shook her head. "I wouldn't have had the nerve." Sylvie pursed her lips and looked up through the corner of her eyes. "Well, maybe I would. But Evelyn wouldn't." "No, I would not," Evelyn said. "I mean, one day it's tasty, the next it's like cardboard. I don't know what to make of it, I'm sure." Gwen drank half a cup of tea, barely able to lift the thin china to her lips, and managed a piece of toast and jam. It all got too much for her when Sylvie pushed the sitting room furniture back against the walls, tuned the wireless to the Forces programme for an hour of swing music, and started practising jive moves with Alec. "Come on, Gwen," she shouted, jitterbugging with twitching limbs. "You be the man. Evelyn can be the woman. We'll show you." Her eyes wide and looking appalled and awed at the same time, Gwen watched Sylvie, then turned an imploring look on Evelyn. "I think we'd better make a move," Evelyn said, feeling annoyed about missing out on the dance practice. Gwen mumbled her goodbyes, her hat and coat on in an instant, linking arms with Evelyn as they strode to the underground. Because Gwen found the journey to Wood Green arduous, Evelyn fetched her and took her home, ending up sleeping the night, as it was invariably too late to make the trip back. It was wearing, and rather puzzling, as Gwen had managed to get to Wales and back by herself. Feeling cheated about missing out on the fun at home had made her decide to confront Gwen. Keeping her voice even, she said, "I'm not sure if I mentioned how plucky I think you were. You know, going all the way to Lansant on your own." Gwen looked down at her feet, then at the spot in the distance she stared at endlessly. "I needed to make sure the kids were all right. Yes, I know. But I don't think I could have made that journey on my own, somewhere I'd never been. So I was wondering, if you can do that, why do you find it so hard to get across London by yourself?" Evelyn could feel Gwen's arms stiffen in hers. "And you get to the bridge and back every day. How do you manage that?" There was a long silence, and Evelyn began to wonder if she'd said too much, or if what she said was unfair and harsh. "I've never thought about it like that before," Gwen said. "But now that I do, I suppose I felt I had to go to Wales, for the kids. And I have to go to work, so I force myself. Just block things out and get on with it." Evelyn knew all about that. Perhaps she wasn't doing Gwen any favours, making it easy for her to stand back from some situations and not plough on as everyone else had to. But she wanted Gwen to continue, to talk about herself rather than the kids, or Betty, or George, so she didn't interrupt. "It ain't that I don't want to be like I was before," Gwen's voice rose. "But journeys around London," she shook her head, "ain't nothing about London is the same. And no one ever knows what's around the corner or what will happen in the next minute. The familiar is unfamiliar." "But didn't you feel that on the way to Wales?" "Not really. I suppose I didn't know what it was like before, and like I said, I was just thinking about the kids. Or maybe the journey used up all my reserves. Perhaps I'll be better when I get my strength back. I don't know. I can't make any more sense of it than that." "Well," Evelyn thought, "we've been thrown together, and I feel an allegiance towards you that I can't fathom either. They picked their way through a length of broken pavement, a crowd of men working hard to mend it. Evelyn sighed and thought that none of what was happening since the war began made any sense at all. But she did so want to help Gwen all she could, and wondered how best to go about that, making sure that it wasn't at the expense of her own fun. A rather good-looking gentleman in a grey overcoat and striped tie gave up his seat for her. Sinking into it, she leaned back and closed her eyes. Even if she spent 3 hours with Gwen, she'd have time for a couple of drinks and a few turns on the dance floor. It was wicked, and she knew it, but she sometimes found it difficult to stop the thought that in many ways this war was the most exciting thing that had ever happened. How else would they ever have had the chance to meet so many different men?
End of CD 4. CD 5.
Alex's cousin Malcolm, for instance, who pursued her with unabashed, good-natured tenacity. Not like Ron, who'd eyed her up for ages before approaching her. Malcolm swung her around the dance floor as if she were a toy who'd lost its stuffing, his own movements casual, almost indolent. He told her stories about Saskatchewan, the vastness of the place overwhelming.
"Oh, that's only one small part of it," he'd say, amused by her amazement. She loved the place names too: Maple Creek, Moose Jaw, Regina. She imagined everyone living in log cabins they had to build with their own hands, plotting out acres of land to defend. "Not anymore," he said. "Not in the cities anyway. Although there's still a hell of a lot of open space. If you want to take a hike, you could go days without seeing another person or a dwelling of any sort." The picture filled her with fascinated trepidation. She'd shuddered and said, "The thought of it gives me the jitters." But she kept him at arm's length and fended off the others who wanted more than a chat and a twirl. Sylvie asked her if she missed Ron and regretted what had happened to their engagement, despite evidence to the contrary. "No, definitely not. I hardly ever think of him now, and when I do it's with relief that it's over." "Is it Joe, then?" "Joe? You know, the great kisser?" Sylvie hugged herself tight, fingers kneading her arms and back, miming a passionate kiss. Evelyn smiled. "He was rather sweet. I do sometimes wonder where he is and what he's doing." "Maybe we could find him." "I don't think so," Evelyn said. "I'm all right as I am. Just because you're no longer free as a bird doesn't mean I can't be." Sylvie let it drop, but Evelyn knew it wouldn't be for long. There was something missing, though, and it wasn't an Alec or Ron, Malcolm or Joe. Yet despite that thought, she stole another glance at the gallant man who'd offered her his seat, and she admitted to herself that someone to feel special for would indeed be lovely. But the true heart of her unrest had something to do with the bridge, and that was another opportunity that wouldn't exist without the war. She would never have had the chance to feel the exhilaration of pouring concrete into formwork that would shape an arch above the river, or cut steel reinforcements, or fix a length of wood into asphalt to mark out the lip of a pavement. Standing on the structure, she felt smaller and meeker as each day went by and the bridge loomed larger and more solid around her. At the same time, she was overcome with a sense of power. She had the ability, the common sense, strength and agility to be part of creating something majestic. No wonder men were so full of themselves. Those feelings must be a part of their everyday lives. A couple of weeks ago, after wetting a pencil on her tongue and checking to make sure no one was watching, she'd written, "Evelyn Draper, aged 23 years, built this bridge, April 1942. On a reinforced concrete beam that would be hidden under the footway." The whole operation gave her a sense of restlessness that she couldn't quite pinpoint, an impatience and disappointment with herself. She wanted to know more about how it all pieced together from starting point to completion, why one design was chosen over another, who chose the materials and for what reasons, how measurements were taken with accuracy. Most of the women didn't care, and there were times when she didn't either, when she was out on the dance floor or having a smoke and a gossip over a cup of tea at break.
A few of them wondered aloud about the logistics and execution. She'd heard Joan talking to Alice in the changing room along the same lines. But as the months had gone by, she seemed to garner more questions and fewer answers. Rather than catch the bus, Evelyn decided to walk from the underground. It was a beautiful afternoon, cloudless and fresh. A few daffodils ringed tree trunks and pushed themselves up in random clusters amongst scattered debris. Perhaps she'd haul Gwen out for a walk, see if there was a cafe in the park where they could get a cup of tea and a bun. She rapped on the door. "Here I am," she said, when Gwen answered. "Look at this weather. Glorious, isn't it? Grab your coat and we'll go for a stroll. I've not seen much round this way." Gwen scraped her hair back and looked down at her slippers. "I ain't dressed properly. Besides, I've got a few things ready for tea here." Evelyn was not going to let her off. "We'll have them when we get back," she said. "Come on, it won't take you a minute to get ready. We're not going to the palace." Gwen stepped out into the sunshine and took a deep breath. "Yeah, all right," she said. "We'll walk up to the park. Give me one mo." There wasn't much left down by the river. Factories and businesses raised to mounds of brick and wood. "When we finish the bridge, we can start on all of this," Evelyn said. "They won't want us," Gwen said, leading the way through her stamping grounds. "Not when the men come back." "If and when. Don't talk like that. It makes me glum." "I'll be blowed," Evelyn thought, and lifted her eyes skyward behind Gwen's back. How often had Gwen been the gloomy one? "Besides, it ain't like you." "No. Oh, no. Sorry. Anyway, we don't know how long it will be until it's all over. Churchill says we'll win soon." "Of course he does. How would we feel if he said there is a real possibility that we could, lose this conflict? And if we do, by any chance, win? I predict that it won't be for many, many long years. Chin up, best foot forward, onward we go." Gwen chuckled. "But we have to believe him, don't we?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "We do. But I still think we might have to carry on with what we're doing all over London. Wouldn't you like that?" "I can't for the life of me think of anything I'd like less." Gwen spat out each word. They stopped and looked down the Thames towards Waterloo. "It's a much different view of the river from here," Evelyn said. "Not as nice as what you mean, ain't it? Even without the bombing. Well, I suppose it should be nicer in the middle of town, you know, around all the lovely old buildings." "It ain't all that bad here," Gwen said, "especially on a day like today. Everywhere looks better when the sun shines." She squeezed Evelyn's hand. "Tar for forcing me out." Evelyn wanted to pursue the subject they'd been discussing. "What would you like to happen then? I mean, we all want the war to end, so don't give me that. What would you rather do than what you're doing now?" They walked through the park gate and made their way up a gentle incline towards a bench. "I'd rather be exactly as we were before. George going out to work, me at home cooking, cleaning, mending, taking the kids to school, meeting them when they finish." Evelyn stretched out her legs and crossed them at the ankles. "But don't you want some of what the men have? A bit of responsibility? A feeling of having done something at the end of the day and getting paid for it?" "I did used to have that feeling. Well-being, Betty calls it. I don't care about the money. George gives me his wages anyway, keeps a bit for his pocket, that's all." "No." She took off her specs and turned her face to the sun. "I want things to go back to how they were." "Well," Evelyn didn't want to sound thoughtless, so hesitated and rehearsed in her mind what to say next. "Given that we can't go backwards, wouldn't you like to move forward?" Gwen rubbed at her eyes. When she spoke, her voice caught. "No. I'll only ever want to go back." A couple walked by, each of them holding the hand of a tot, teetering on his feet like a graceless fawn. Evelyn laughed when they swung him between them, and he squealed with delight, then felt guilty for enjoying the moment. Can we get tea anywhere? She asked. That pavilion over there? Shall we have it here? They let you bring it out. The day's too lovely to be indoors. I'll fetch them, Evelyn said, not wanting to break the spell that was bringing the first trace of colour to Gwen's pallid face, the first suggestion of brightness to her eyes. Balancing the cups and saucers on the grass, they broke off pieces of a day-old iced bun and licked the syrupy sugar from their fingers, Gwen flinching when a trace of stickiness seeped into a sore hangnail. She skimmed a tiny fly from her tea and flicked it to the ground. George is being posted out of London, she said. Is he? Said Evelyn. How long will he be gone? 6 to 8 weeks at a time. Gwen seemed nonplussed. Moving troops around, I think. Oh, Evelyn said. I thought he'd been allowed to join up at last. No, though he did try again. Must be the 10th time at least he's asked the railway to release him. He's wasting his time then. And everyone else's, Gwen said. They ain't about to let the drivers go. Although George says there's plenty of girls around who could do it and be grateful for the work. Well, he's right there, Evelyn said. There are a lot of ladies on the tracks as it is, cleaning, repairing, taking tickets. I've heard there's to be a couple of women guards, believe it or not. Of course I believe it. But no drivers. Bit like us, then. Evelyn couldn't stay off the topic of the bridge for long. I suppose so. But some that wanted to are working the cranes now. Evelyn sat up and sprinkled the dregs of her lukewarm tea over the ground. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she said, I wanted to. I know, Gwen said. But Jim said you'd be chosen next time, didn't he? He had, and that had appeased her a bit, but now it had been brought up again she felt herself bridle. There was always something she couldn't do for one reason or another. Irritation spread through her like a nasty infection. It was the company's prerogative to select who they wanted, she supposed, but surely it would have been fairer to say there were so many places available and ask for those interested to come forward. There was no way of knowing the factors involved in making the decision to ask such a one and not another. Take Joan. From her speaking voice, it would be presumed she was well educated. So was that why she was chosen? Evelyn knew she didn't speak half as nicely as Joan, but she'd been educated. She'd been a teacher for a while, after all. But other women chosen didn't speak like they were reciting Shakespeare. So was the decision based on the grounds of their hard work? If that was the case, Gwen should have been asked. Her nose was to the grindstone from the minute she started until leaving off time. Anyway, Gwen was saying, it's all over bar the shouting. We're tarmacking the top. Only 2 lanes out of 6, Evelyn said. There's a fair bit to do yet. Portland stone facings, the railings, light standards, the steps, finishing off. Then there's the temporary bridge. It'll have to be dismantled, I suppose. Oh well, Gwen sighed. I don't know about all that. I'll just do what I'm told. A tiny sparrow hopped towards the crumbs left on their plate, eyes bulging and dilated with panic, its head twitching from side to side, alert to any danger. Looks like a warden on the prowl for a light, Evelyn said. We can't put that one out, said Gwen, pointing to the ball of sun, stark in the deep blue sky. Come on. We won't hurt you. She clicked her tongue softly and edged the plate towards the skittish bird. Something about the way she did it made Evelyn ask, Have you heard from the kids? A letter came from each of them yesterday. Are they getting on all right now? Gwen nodded. Having a great time. I'm worried they won't want to come home. Don't be daft. Course they will. I've left them out for you, the little notes. Let's go back then, Evelyn said, so I can read them. They ate the lovely tea Gwen had prepared, tongue sandwiches, fudge made with carrots, a baked apple with a splash of condensed milk. All diffidence gone, they talked as if they'd known each other for years, until Evelyn took a deep breath and told Gwen she wasn't going to stay. I've had another invitation, she said, not wanting to fib. Oh? Gwen looked interested. A date? Not exactly, Evelyn said. She got to her feet to make her point. But you never know. It might lead to one. Evelyn thought Gwen would protest, but she looked no more than a little disappointed. Well, I have had such a lovely day. That fresh air did me the world of good. I ain't going to be long before I get my head down." She walked Evelyn to the door. "Have a good time and mind how you go." That was easy, Evelyn thought. Perhaps that's the way to play it from now on, so we have the best of both worlds. Or maybe Gwen is on the mend at last. One evening in June, Sylvie and Alec took Dad to see Song of the Islands.
"It was great," he said, "especially that Betty Grable."
He let out a low whistle and fanned his face.
"What a cracking pair of legs. It was a good story to boot, but I enjoyed the Pathé more."
He went on to explain how the whole newsreel had been about the RAF 1,000 bomber raids on Cologne.
"On the Chin," it was called.
With clenched fists, Dad and Alec uppercut the air, swiping short of each other's jutting jaws. "Watch it, you two," Sylvie said. "We don't want an injury."
"Would that be classed as a war wound?" Alec said, dancing around Dad with his dukes up.
"Maybe in a roundabout way," Evelyn said, laughing. "Silly buggers." Dad collapsed into his chair, puffing and holding his hands up in defeat.
"That was the catchphrase," he said. "Air Marshal Harris kept repeating it. Let them have it, right on the chin." "And our guys did," Alec said. "There's nothing left of Cologne to talk about." "That's right," Dad said. "And we'll keep giving it and taking it right here."
He pointed to his lower lip.
"Until there's nothing jerry-rigged left."
As the weeks went by without any news from Jim, Evelyn remembered that slogan and meant to let Jim have it on the chin the next time an opportunity presented itself. She practised what she would say. One day it was, "Excuse me, Jim. I thought you were going to get back to me soon about doing something with more responsibility." The next it was, "I'm very cross, Jim, about the way this whole crane-driving business has been handled." And then, "What about me? When will it be my turn?" Until at last she mustered herself, thought of Air Marshal Harris and the RAF bombers, and knocked on his office door. Lifting his eyes from a mountain of documents he and a circle of men were scrutinising, Jim said,
"I'll be about 5 minutes, Evelyn. Can you wait?"
Evelyn looked at the wall clock, hanging crooked and covered in dust. She had 10 minutes of her break left. "Yes, all right," she said. The men huddled over the papers, shaking out large transparent sheets covered in an oily sheen and laying them one on top of the other. Turning the drawings upside down, pointing to small smudged sections, they frowned, nodded, grimaced a maybe. Evelyn wondered which part of the bridge was having its fate decided. She looked out of a grimy window, where muck slowly gathering in the corners of the glass put her in mind of a greasy egg timer. Half of the workforce was on a break, but still there were countless numbers swarming over the site, each a resolute grafting ball of energy. Olive's wiry frame was evident, and her voice would probably hit them full force too, if Evelyn opened the door. Sylvie was scurrying along a walkway with a load of piping on her shoulder. Books and newspapers were scattered on a small table next to the tea urn, as if they'd been thrown there from a distance. Evelyn picked up a copy of the Illustrated London News and looked at the photographs of the Baedeker raids on Canterbury. She scanned the rest of the pile. Nothing interesting until she came to the bottom of the heap and saw a journal from the Institute of Civil Engineers. Flipping through the pages, she started on the articles with relish, but lost heart a couple of paragraphs into each piece. She didn't understand a word. Sighing, she glanced down the inside cover of the periodical still in her hand. Acknowledgements were made to various people, with trailing sequences of letters after their names. C. Eng, FCIOB, PhD, MSc Eng, FR Eng, MCIOB, P. Eng, MSPE. Thanks were also given to the Society of Engineers, the Institute of Structural Engineers, and the WES, the Women's Engineering Society. Engineering. It had never been mentioned to Evelyn as a possibility. She'd been thrilled when she came top in her last year in the juniors, the well-thumbed book she was awarded at prize-giving, a treasure on a shelf in the sitting room. When the headmaster said she was able enough for the seniors, and to go on further than that if Dad agreed, The careers she was pointed towards were few and vocational: nursing, teaching, veterinarian assistant, personal secretary, nursery nurse. That was about it. But the girls who belonged to this society must have been given engineering amongst their choices. The men were folding their papers along well-creased lines, sharing a joke, shaking hands. Evelyn memorised the address of the Wes, then threw the journal down with the others.
"Evelyn," Jim said, turning towards her. "What a coincidence. I was about to call you in."
He scratched the top of his head, leaving a pink welt pushing through the few strands of hair he had left. He smiled and pulled up a wooden chair to sit with her. She did so want to believe him, so let him go first.
"I haven't forgotten your query," he said, "but at the moment—" his arms floundered and flapped. "There's nothing on the Cranes."
"But there is still a possibility."
"There's always that," he said. "It depends on which men join up and when. Might you be interested in being forewoman, or should it be forelady, of a gang of 6? That could be on the cards."
For a minute, Evelyn balked. Saying yes to something specific was one thing, but agreeing to such a vaguely named position was another. It could be fixing the formwork or some such thing, something she knew nothing about. But she wasn't about to let an opportunity like this get away. "Would there be training?"
"Yes," Jim said. "We'd make sure of that."
"All right then. Please consider me."
"Good for you," he said, looking relieved.
They sat in silence for a couple of seconds, Jim drumming his fingertips on his leg.
"Now," he said, "was there something else?"
"Oh," Evelyn said. "No, nothing. That was it."
"Righto then,"
Jim said, rubbing his hands together.
"I'll get it all sorted."
Over the following month, while she waited for Jim to arrange the training, Evelyn again thought of Dad's new motto and took herself to the Wes reading room on Regent Street. She'd expected something grand and formidable like the National Gallery or University College Hospital. Instead, number 20 was nothing more than a large shop front blending in with all the others along the road. The brass plate next to the door told her she was in the right place, but she held back, not sure herself why she'd come or what she would say when she ventured in. She could try, "I mix concrete, cut girders," or perhaps, "I navvy on a building site." She could explain that she'd read about the society in a journal and wanted to know more, keep it simple and to the point. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and tinkled a polished handbell on the reception desk. "Can I be of help?" A plump woman in a fitted charcoal suit appeared from a room behind the counter. Evelyn was surprised at how ordinary she looked. She could have been anyone's mother or sister, going about ordinary women's business. Evelyn didn't want to lose her nerve. "I'm interested in finding out what you do here." "We're the Wes." The woman indicated a black and white monogram in a frame on the counter. Inside the octagonal shape, what looked like a leather belt and buckle encircled a monolith entwined with a vine, the lettering Wes transposed on top. "Are you an engineer?" "No, I'm afraid not." "How have you come to hear about us then, my dear?" "I'm on the tools." "Oh, I see. Your war work." "Yes, but—" Evelyn wanted to say her job seemed to be more than that now, but didn't want to sound lame. "Please, go on," the woman said, sounding as if she had all the time in the world to listen. "I'm curious to know more about the whole procedure, how it all happens." "You have an inquiring mind, then. Good." The woman looked satisfied, as if assured she had made a sagacious observation. "I hope she doesn't test that theory," Evelyn thought. "What you need is right this way. Sign the visitor's book and follow me." They walked through a maze of cubbyholes and archways, writing desks, armchairs and tables, up 2 narrow flights of stairs, to a set of double doors with a sign reading "Library" above them. Rows of bookcases were packed into the dark, high-ceilinged room, the windows having been replaced with wood for safety. Rests were angled on long tables, books, magazines and drawings propped against them, while 5 or 6 women took notes, lines of concentration on their faces. "You can't check any books out today, but do take all the time you like," the woman whispered. "I'll give you a copy of our periodical when you leave." She turned and closed the doors behind her. Intent on their research, the other women didn't pay any attention to her. Feeling like a complete fraud, she tiptoed to the nearest fusty gangway and hid herself behind the stacks. She plucked random volumes from the shelves, pushing them back into their vacant slots, when she came across the same unfathomable vocabulary she tried to make sense of in Jim's journal. It might as well have been hieroglyphics or oriental symbols. She couldn't start somewhere in the middle. It had to be the beginning, and these books had gone beyond that point. Not wanting to have to make excuses to the woman downstairs, who had so much faith in her intellect, she found a chair wedged in an airless corner, away from view, and fell asleep. "Did you find that useful?" the woman asked her as she signed out. "I've never seen anything like it." "I'm glad we could help. Will we see you again?" "It's a bit of a trudge for me," Evelyn said, "and then I work shifts." "That's a shame." She handed Evelyn a copy of The Woman Engineer, a smiling girl in dungarees and turban holding a spanner on the front cover. Evelyn chuckled. "That's me when I'm on the job," she said. "We all dress like that." "Not very fetching, but wholly practical." "I should be honest with you," Evelyn said, swiping the air over her head. "That up there was way above me." The woman didn't seem too disappointed in her, as Evelyn thought she might be. "Start with the journal, then," she said. "It might begin to make some sort of sense if you plough through. Perhaps you'd like to come along to our conference. It's next door in Dorland House in September, with a dinner afterwards at the Forum Club." "Wouldn't I have to be a member?" "You certainly qualify if you do that." She pointed to the cover girl. "Would you like to join? It won't take a minute." "Yes, I would. If you're sure." "Have a bit of faith in yourself." Evelyn filled in the form she was given and thanked the woman for her help. "Stick with it," she said. "An interest's all it takes. This war can't last forever, and then we can do whatever we like." Evelyn wished she could be so sure on both counts. Chapter 8. August to November 1942. Gwen. Tuesday, the 11th of August 1942. Dear Will, thank you for your newsy letter. I enjoyed reading it, and I showed it to Dad, Betty, Len and Evelyn, who I've told you about. Do you remember? She works with me and likes to hear all about you and Ruth. We're hoping she'll be able to meet you before too long. You asked if I would be amazed to hear that your football team won the summer tournament over the local lads, and I must tell you that I'm not surprised at all. I would have been shocked if you had lost, as any team with you playing for them is bound to win. How exciting that Marty scored the deciding goal and you set it up. I could picture the ball being passed to you and you kicking it with all your might to Marty, who headed it into the net. Did you hear me cheering from here when I read that bit? Millwall will definitely want a pair of chums like you when we get back to normal. I think it was very good of Mr. Gwilt to go along and watch the final match. So the village boys didn't want to call you by any of the names we thought up for your team? Not even the London lads? I suppose once they got the vackies into their heads, they couldn't get it out. But it's good they're not mean to you anymore. Yes, I did hear about Marty's dad. I know that he must be feeling very sad, but it's good he's got you to share a room and play football with. I'm glad you remembered what Betty said about Johnny, and that you can now tell Marty that his daddy is a hero too. I'm glad you liked the picture card of an engine that Dad sent you. He sent me one with flowers on the front. He likes having to go away because he feels he's doing more to help win the war than when he was stuck here in London. Today I had the whole morning off to go and watch the first part of a bridge being opened. You know I can't tell you the name of the bridge, as I tried to once before and you received my letter with a big hole cut out of the middle of the page. 2 lanes of this bridge were ready today and people were very excited because it will be easier for them to get from one side of the river to the other. A man named Charlie Barnard opened the bridge. I can't for the life of me think why he was chosen. He's only a steel fixer. He lifted 7 red flags out of their weights and a load of men pushed aside some barriers. We thought that was that until a race started up without any warning. There was a bus, 2 taxis, a horse and cart, and even an American jeep. But a boy with long lanky legs was the first to make it to the north side. You know, where all the big buildings are. I've never seen anyone pump so hard on a push bike. His name is Leonard Mitchell. He is 16 years of age, and I heard someone say he lives in Balham. Everyone clapped and cheered for him. It was great fun. I told my friends that you would have beaten him if you'd been there, as I know you're as fast as lightning. Betty came with me to watch and she agreed. It's hard to believe that Dot has grown into such a big dog. She was a tiny puppy and I thought she'd stay quite small. Is she eating Auntie Peggy out of house and home? Ruthie wrote and told me about her knee, but said it's getting better now. I'm glad you were with her when it happened so you could take care of her. I told her not to pick the scab as it will leave a scar. Can you remind her when you see her? Please don't get so carried away with football that you forget your lessons. Mind your manners and say ta to Mrs. Gwilt for everything she does for you. You are my good boy. Lots and lots of love from Mum. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Gwen cleared her things away and looked at the clock. She'd give it another 15 minutes before nipping into Betty's for an hour or so. They'd strolled along to the bridge together that morning, both of them dressed in smart skirts and low heels. Betty had a paste brooch sparkling on her lapel, a new feather tucked into the band of an old felt hat that she wore tilted over one eyebrow. Gwen had used a tinted colour shampoo on her hair that she'd bought from Joan, who somehow always managed to have a number of bits and bobs to sell from her work bag. Autumn Chestnut, the label read. It was either that or Ebony Night, which Gwen had thought would be too dramatic a change. What she hadn't reckoned on was the red sheen of the conker shell being more predominant than the brown. Her grey hair was covered, and that was the main thing. When she curled the ends under and clipped it at the nape of her neck, the overall effect had given her a lift. The weather had been glorious. There was a balmy breeze, a trace of river in the air. A knot of ragged kids had set up a game of cricket, upturned bricks for stumps, a plank of rotten wood for a bat. As they passed, one of the lads slammed the poor misshapen ball with a crack and ran towards a makeshift wicket, wiping a streak of dirt from his nose across his face. Gwen knew when Betty steered her into the road it was not to avoid being hit, but to save her from the upset that usually surfaced when she found herself close to children. It was always painful, but this time Gwen didn't turn to stare with longing, but looked straight ahead towards where they were going. She could feel Betty studying her. "I do believe you're looking much better these last few days," Betty said. "I'm glad to see it." Gwen smoothed a strand of hair behind the arm of her spectacles. "This tint's done wonders. That and a vinegar rinse. And all for 1 and 6. A bargain. Would you like me to get a tube for you?" "Me?" Betty laughed aloud. "I've gone well beyond that," she said, fingering her mottled silver waves. "Besides, I try not to get Len too excited." She pointed to her chest. "Doesn't do his ticker much good." Gwen smiled. Len chasing Betty around the bedroom was an amusing thought, although they'd been together for years, so they must have enjoyed their fair share of that side of married life. After they lost their Johnny, Gwen didn't think she'd ever be interested in such things again. They'd slept apart initially, she with the other 2 children, George on his own. And when they did get back into their own bed together, George made no move towards her. Each of them hugged their side of the mattress, turning away from the other, as if there was an invisible line of defence down the middle of the bed. At first, Gwen was pleased with the situation, not able to think of anything worse than the crush of him on top of her. But as time went on, she began to miss the familiar folds of his skin, slightly slick with effort, the nuzzle of his rough beard on her neck and breasts, the solid outline of his legs and buttocks. But it was too late by then. They'd forgotten how to talk to each other, how to be together. Until last week when George was home for a few days. "No, it ain't just the air," Betty was saying. "You're beginning to seem more like your old self." She traced Gwen's features with her eyes, as if trying to determine where the changes lay. "I can't tell how," she said, "but you're definitely brighter." "It helps to have things like this to look forward to," Gwen said. "Oh, I know. Tar for asking me. Don't talk too soon, Gwen said, as they turned off the embankment. It might be as dull as a wet weekend in Bognor. But Betty did enjoy the morning. They both had. More for the company than the unceremonious opening lacking in fanfare or flourish. A bobby ushered them towards a queue of onlookers standing behind a barrier. Opposite, a line of cranes stood idle, waiting patiently for this insignificant interruption to pass so they could get on with the important work. Evelyn was standing towards the front with a group of women, and when she caught Gwen's eye, she motioned for her and Betty to join them. "They ain't allowed to have any pomp." Olive was loud and proud. "Them Jerrys might catch wind of it and poof!" She snapped her fingers. "It'd go down like a house of cards. You think this is tough?" She banged on the asphalt with the heel of her shoe. "It ain't no stronger than cardboard to Fritz." "Keep your voice down," Sylvie said. "Jerry doesn't need spies when you're broadcasting loud and clear." "Your foghorn could be a secret weapon, Olive," Evelyn joined in. "Very useful where there's no transmitter signal." There were a few others Gwen recognised amongst the small crowd, but not as many as she thought she might see. She supposed most people had used the opportunity to have a lie-in or catch up with the housework. The thought had occurred to her, but she was pleased she'd made the decision to go along and take Betty, who was having a good chat with Evelyn. Patches of sunlight chequered the smooth, clean roadway that had been undefiled until today, when it was handed over to be pounded and trampled. She wondered how long it would stand, and what it would see and hear during all those years. Behind her, she could hear the women talking, their voices rising and falling, the occasional burst of laughter. She wasn't listening to what they were saying, but felt comfortable to be with them, an accepted part of the crowd she'd shied away from. She scratched tentatively along the surface of the raw spot deep inside her that was Johnny, the flow of pain emanating from the fresh wound as powerful as ever. That might dull in time, or it might never change, but something was different, a tiny glimmer of appreciation for what she had now. There was a sense of hopefulness about the day, a structure so set in stone being partially open to the uncertainties of the future. Traffic trundled past. The race was won. The gathering dispersed. Gwen saw Betty onto the number 15 back to Cubitt Town. "That Olive really is something," Betty said, laughing. "She's much more forward than you described. And Alice, what a sweet little girl." "Everyone loves Alice. She's from the country near Bristol. Why she ever left there for London, I'll never know. And Evelyn mentioned a young man who I think she's been seeing a bit of. You never said." "You probably know more about him than I do. She's keeping him as close to her chest as a good hand of gin rummy." Gwen laughed at the thought. "You'll have to fill me in with what she let on to you." "And who was that man with Joan?" Betty went on, excited by what the day, so beyond their usual routine, had dug up. The gossip would keep them going for weeks. "At least I think he was with her, the way they looked at each other. But then he walked away without saying cheerio." "I'll tell you about it later," Gwen said. "What I know, anyway, which ain't much." "All right, love," Betty said, stepping up onto the platform of the bus. "I'll see you this evening." Turning on the lamp now, Gwen checked the contents of her satchel for the morning. Fresh shirt, socks, boots, headscarf, coin purse. The flask was draining in the kitchen. She nestled the letter to Will, ready to post amongst the clean clothes. Feeling around the bottom and sides of the weather-beaten canvas bag, she fished out a loose fag paper, a boiled sweet Evelyn had given her, the stub of a pencil, and the card from George. It had arrived in an envelope 3 days ago, the first letter she'd ever received from him. On the front was a drawing of pink and lilac wildflowers, held together by a draped blue bow. She couldn't read the Latin name in italic lettering underneath the dewy stems. As a girl, she'd loved to collect flowers, and her father had made a press for her 12th birthday, the rivets perfectly aligned so the wood met without an overlap. The pungent scent of the bursting blossoms as she squashed them flat made her giddy. She'd related this to George and told him about the book entitled The Language of Flowers that she'd read a few years later. When they first married, George would pick a flower from the park or garden and present it to her, saying, "What does this mean, then?" I don't know, she'd say, giggling. I can't remember. He'd tut and shake his head with mock disappointment. I do, and I ain't read the book. It means I love you. Turning the card over, she reread the message on the back. George, kiss. Perhaps it was being apart that had made them tentatively begin to feel closer. On the last night of his leave, George had come to bed late, slipping dumbly into the sheets next to her. He lay on his back, then turned over. She fidgeted, loosening the taut bedclothes. Neither of them seemed to make a move towards the other, but somehow they touched mouths, tongues, timid fingers sliding over comforting bumps and hollows. She pulled him on top of her, and he bellowed like a bull, panting into her hair. They didn't say a word, but cried softly with their arms around each other. How she wished it had happened on the first day of his leave. Then they could have had some time to sit together peacefully like they used to, or to say a few words about their worries without fear of argument or blame. She kissed the card and held it to her heart. She'd lost so much. They'd lost so much. She couldn't bear it if they lost each other. For 6 weeks, Evelyn spent her mornings in Jim's office with 3 other women and 2 men, learning how to take charge of a gang of 6. She reappeared at dinner time, loose papers and notepads balanced in the crook of her arm. Gwen couldn't see what the fascination was, or why Evelyn took it so seriously. Perhaps it was the extra bob she'd get in her pay packet when she was fully trained. If anyone had told her when she started work that she would miss her partner, she'd have dismissed them without feeling the need to explain herself. As if she could possibly have found anything left inside her to give to a stranger. But now she gazed in the direction of the gaffer's hut and looked forward to the door opening and Evelyn coming towards her to share her news. Gwen assumed that she'd be one of Evelyn's crew. In the meantime, she'd been instructed to help with unloading the vats of tar. Obnoxious stuff. She hated the blistering globules that burst on the surface of the greasy liquid, so black it was shot through with blue. It reminded her of a heavy pan of treacle left on the stove too long without the advantage of the toffee's cloying sweetness. The stench was vile, coating the lining of her nose and mouth with an invisible viscous film she could feel as it built up, taste on her tongue and the back of her throat, the smell exuding from every inch of her skin. It made her retch and gag, long after knocking off time. One of the other girls had given her a hanky to hold over her mouth and told her to bring one of her own in to use. When the weather turned and the washing wouldn't dry, she ran out of hankies, so went without for a day. That evening, no matter what she did, she couldn't rid herself of the acid reek of coagulated pitch. When she went to bed, she lay on her side, staring into the blackness that slithered and shifted into a silo of tar that she stirred from the top of a platform with a giant comic book paddle. She fell in without warning, calling for Evelyn, thrashing around and trying for a foothold until her airways were clogged and she sank, pulled down by the gummy material that clung to her, inside and out. Waking, she gasped for breath, her heart pounding. She straightened the messy covers, pulling them over her damp and chilly nightgown. The room slipped away again, hunkering down in the place where she used to go to be alone when she first started on the bridge. The river was at her feet, the scaffolding over her head. The water boiled and fizzed, gas vapours rose and swirled around her. She was trapped as the mild Thames became a rushing tide of ink-coloured goo, one almighty wave engulfing her, dragging her down to the bottom, where she stuck fast like a defeated tar baby. In the morning, her eyelids felt as if they were weighted, and she ached all over. Her face was burning, but she had goose flesh under her nightie. Trying to sit up, she was knocked back by a cough that came from somewhere deep inside where it rasped and bubbled. Betty's face floated above her, the lines between her eyes squeezed together in a frown. The doctor drifted in and out of view, the click of his case too loud to bear, the stethoscope a block of ice on her fiery skin. 10 days passed, until Gwen was able to sit up properly. The day after that, Betty helped her downstairs to the sitting room, George's dressing gown around her shoulders. She felt weak, her wedding band slipping around her thin finger when she took the teacup from Betty with both hands. "Oh, you did give me a fright," Betty said, cupping Gwen's hands as they held the saucer until she was steady enough to be left with it. Gwen's mouth felt parched and thick. She worried her tongue over the jagged bits of skin hanging from her lips. "I'm sorry, Bet," she said. "I'm such a nuisance to you." "No," Betty set her mouth in a thin line. "No, you're not." She leaned in closer to Gwen. "You're my dearest friend, and I'd do anything for you." Gwen took a sip of tea, scalding hot in her furred mouth. "But it never seems my turn to help you." Betty took the cup from her shaking hands and put it on the side table. "Don't you go worrying about that. You've done your fair share for me." Gwen hoped so, but she couldn't remember what she might have done or when. Fatigue caught up with her. Her eyelids drooped and she felt as though she were drifting. "Was it the tar?" she asked. "The what?" "I was put on the tar, and it got into me somehow." "No, love," Betty said. "You've had flu. The doctor said so." Gwen hacked a thick cough that felt easier than it had in days. "I thought it was choking me." "It was, that nasty cough. Not the tar. If you hadn't turned for the better when you did, the doctor was going to put you in Bethnal Green." Betty stood and started to bustle, checking her apron pockets and turning back the sleeves of her cardigan. "Has George been home?" "I wrote and told him you were poorly. He sent a telegram saying he'd come back directly. Then I sent another telling him there was no need." "Oh." Gwen opened her eyes, remembering the card she'd been delighted with. "I've lost track of time. When is his next leave? Do you know, Bet?" "Should be the day after tomorrow. Now you stay there. I'll get some powdered egg from my larder. Make us a bit of scrambled. Might have some myself. All right, love." "Tar, Betty, can I bother you for one more thing? Please pass me my work bag. I think it's in the corner near the back door." She placed it on her lap and dug around in it until her fingers found the card from George. It felt good to be up and dressed, although it was arduous to move her wobbling limbs from room to room. After a few minutes, she flopped gratefully into a chair and waited for the listlessness to pass, then had another go at accomplishing some small task. Betty insisted the doctor call again, although Gwen protested about the cost, as her wages had been stopped since she fell ill. But the tonic he prescribed helped right away, and he was able to reassure her that she would be back to her old self within weeks, if she was sensible. What she could really have done with now, the day George was due, was another bottle of autumn chestnut. When she next saw Joan, she would get 2, so she had one in reserve. She managed to pin her hair off her face and pinch some colour into her cheeks, tweeze at a few wayward eyebrows. Her favourite leaf-print navy dress, the one that had flattered her so well, fell in an almost straight line from shoulders to hem. So often she'd heard Evelyn and Sylvie talking about altering their clothes, that she thought she'd have a go with a belt, tucking folds of material in pleats over her slack hips at the back. Betty helped her to set out a cold tea. All Gwen needed to do when George came in was boil the kettle. There was even a bottle of beer for him in the pantry. George clicked on the lamp, and Gwen woke with a start, saliva dripping down her chin and pooling in the wrinkles at the top of her cleavage. He'd pulled the blackouts and set their plates on trays. The kettle was wheezing on the stove. "I'm sorry, George," she said, uncurling her legs and making to get up. He smoothed her hair with 3 long strokes. "Stay where you are," he said. "Everything's under control." She lifted her face and he laughed, wiping her mouth with the back of his hand before he kissed her. They ate off their laps in the dull light of the sitting room. Outside, the rain pinged against the windows, tinkling like glass on glass. There would be another scattering of sad, burnished-coloured leaves to sweep in the morning. George asked Gwen about her illness, saying he thought she still had a way to go until she was back on her feet. They exchanged news they'd had from the kids, reassuring themselves they were happy and cared for. "What's Swindon like?" Gwen asked. "You probably know as much about Swindon as I do," George said. "All I know is the train station and my digs." "How is the guest house?" "It's hardly that. Every room is full of blokes working away from home." "I didn't realise you had to share a room." "Share a room?" George snorted.
Bloody hell, that would be a luxury. We have to share beds. Day shift gets out early morning, night shift gets in, and so it goes on. Nice and warm from the last chap. God knows when the sheets get washed."
Gwen stared at George, her knife and fork motionless in her hands. "What about the landlady? Can't you complain to her?"
"Whoa!" George's voice quavered in mock terror. "You wouldn't want to mess with Mrs. Sillery, or Mrs. Slipshod as we call her."
"Why? Tell me about her."
"She stands like this," George said.
He stood, hands on hips, legs wide apart, a gurning scowl on his face.
"Her old pinny is covered in greasy stains."
"Horrid,"
Gwen said. "Her legs are bare and veins stand out all along the backs of her calves, like bruised, bloated earthworms."
Gwen was doubling over, enjoying the picture so much that her ribs, already sore from coughing, pulled tighter.
"That's not all," George said. "She has lank white hair. Strands of it stick to her shiny forehead, and sometimes she tries to peel them off."
He brushed some of his own greying hair forward, then pretended to pick it off his skin as if it was glued with solidified fat.
"There's always a rancid smell of stale cooking wafting around her, and no matter if you're coming in or going out, she says the same thing. 'You're cutting it a bit fine, ain't ya?'"
"Oh dear." Gwen held her stomach. "No more, George, please." George sat back down and finished his beer. Gwen put her cutlery together on her plate. It's good to sit like this, Gwen thought, but there was something in between them that was keeping them apart. No matter how they tried to skirt around it, or talk over it, push it away long enough to make love under the weight of it, it was there, stopping them from reaching each other. She knew what it was. It was Johnny, or rather what had happened to Johnny. And it was more than that. It was the fact that they'd never talked about it, not to the extent the tragedy deserved. She waited, wondering if this was the right time. Probably not. But if not now, then she was afraid they would go on behaving in a stiff, courteous manner towards each other, going through the motions but never feeling the depth of each other's hurt, never understanding fully, never clearing that mountain of rubble between them. She looked over at George and smiled.
"Glad to see some colour in your cheeks," he said.
A few minutes passed.
"Perhaps when things are back to how they were, we can take a trip to Swindon, have a look around at the things I've missed. Maybe take the kids."
"I'd like that." Another silence. "Do you remember that night, not long before the kids went to Wales?" She was sure he did by the startled look in his eyes.
"Which one?"
he said, tilting the beer to his lips and straining for one last drop. "When I came into the kitchen, it was late, and you started to tell me what happened that night. You know, the night Johnny—"
"I know which bloody night. I ain't bloody simple."
George staggered to his feet, clenching and unclenching his fists, looking around like a madman searching for something to throw. "All right, George," Gwen said, strangled by a coughing fit. "Never mind."
"Just when things were starting to look up."
His hands relaxed. He sat on the arm of her chair and rubbed her back. "I'm sorry, George." Gwen put a hand on his thigh, but he moved away back to his place.
"It's no good saying never mind. I do mind. 24 hours of every single day."
He turned to her, his face etched with lines she hadn't noticed.
"Do you think I've forgotten? How could I?"
"I don't think that. It's just that you never finished telling me what happened after Johnny ran." George let out a long, tired sigh.
"I ain't sure. I can."
"Perhaps another time," Gwen said. By his reaction, she thought she might have to get used to living with the obstacles between them. He looked at the clock.
"I might see if Lem wants to walk down for a pint. Shall I get Betty to sit with you?"
Gwen shook her head. He took the plates into the kitchen, and she heard him rinsing his hands and face. He came through with a cup of tea for her, coat on, cap in hand. She took the cup and could feel him watching her trembling hands. Then he sat down with a huff.
"It never leaves me,"
he began, looking at the corner above the picture rail.
never gives me any peace. On and on it goes. Round and round.
I know. It's the same for me.
Is it?
He said, looking at her for an instant, his eyes narrowed with misgiving. He found his spot to stare at again.
It's as if even the smells are still on my skin and up my nose.
He snorted, then sniffed in with a crack.
Smoke and burning. Blood.
His voice caught.
The wet wool of his coat.
Gwen shivered, pulling her cardigan around her.
That night,
he flinched, as if in pain.
It was worse than ever. Everything was going up.
He choked on a grunt.
Except what was falling down. I remember.
He hesitated, rubbing his face with his hands.
That almighty explosion.
I heard it too, Gwen whispered. From Price's.
The noise. I'd never heard anything like it.
He put his hands to his ears.
I swear it made the flesh on my face judder and wobble, like I had the palsy. Everyone froze. It wouldn't have been possible to move through it. Then we turned to see the whole of Manchester Road alight. I can't get it out of my mind.
He hit his forehead hard with his fist.
It's printed there, in my head, deep inside.
A dry sob set off Gwen's cough again.
Let's give it a rest.
George pressed his thumbs on his eyelids.
It's over. Finished.
No, Gwen breathed steadily, making an effort to calm herself.
What good will it do?
Please, George. He shook his head.
It was hell down there. A bloody hell. I'd never seen anything like it.
It was terrible, Gwen said.
Someone shouts at me to join the chain reeling hoses from a fire engine. Then I was told to leave that and help with the stretcher. Get round the back there, someone barks, and stop those bloody flames from spreading. I grabbed 2 buckets of sand and run as close as I can to the edge of the fire. I hear him then, before I see him. He calls to me. Dad! Dad!
Nausea hit Gwen. She wrapped her arms around her stomach.
I honestly could not. I could not believe it. I turn, and there he is. Johnny. Our Johnny. Out in the middle of that.
George blew his nose and wiped at his face.
Ever since I've tried so hard to piece it all together. Why did he run from me?
George shouted, pounding his hands on his knees.
Why? He must have thought I was cross. That must have been it. In the shadows, he must have thought I was angry, and he just ran away into that building. I called out and chased after him, but he didn't come to me. The whole place was falling in on top of us, and he was so little.
Gwen felt dizzy, as if she was shifting from one world to another. George had his eyes closed, tears pooling in the purple hollows beneath them.
Oh, George!
Gwen looked around for some comfort. She reached for her tea but couldn't manage to pick it up.
I should have smiled at him.
George hung his head.
Stupid, I know. But if only I had, and put my arms out, he would have run straight into them, and I could have had him home. Told him off and safe in bed within a quarter of an hour.
You can't blame yourself. Gwen couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could you?
If I'd been quicker. I'm so bloody clumsy. Instead of shouting his name, I should have somehow let him know I wasn't cross.
George, you mustn't do this to yourself. I'm the one who's to blame. It's all my doing. Gwen reached for his hand, but he snatched it away, a snarl on his lips.
You've said that so many times, he said, especially in the beginning.
But it's true. I had him here, in my...
Over and over again like a scratched record. Then you beg me to tell you my side of things and you don't even bloody well listen. What do you want? tell me, because I ain't got a clue.
He threw his cap on his head and slammed the door on his way out. The bed was divided once more. George talked to her when necessary. Other than that, he just grunted. There were no more impersonations of the unsavoury landlady, who it seemed he couldn't wait to get back to. Evelyn came to visit, bringing all the chit-chat that Gwen hadn't asked to hear. She said she was sorry Gwen hadn't been well, and she should take her time before she started back. The gaffer had picked his gangs of 6, but Gwen wouldn't be with Evelyn. She was going to be on something less tiring than dismantling the old temporary bridge. "But we can still see each other at dinner," Evelyn said. "Break times too, and on our days off. It won't be any different." But it would be different. Anything good always changed for the worse. "Never mind," Gwen said. "Don't matter." After Evelyn left, Betty found Gwen sitting again, gazing at something far away, her hands locked under her chin. Untouched for weeks, the uneven nails had grown to the top of her fingertips, the scabs around them ready to reveal pink skin underneath. She didn't have the energy to put them in her mouth and grind. "Don't go dwelling on things, love," she said when Gwen told her about the new work arrangements. "The doctor said you're bound to feel down when you're getting over the flu. You mustn't forget your tonic." The day before she started back on the bridge, church bells rang out for the first time since the war began. They pealed with joy for the victory at El Alamein. Churchill spoke on the radio and warned everyone that they must not think of this as the end. It wasn't, according to him, anywhere near the start of the end. But the nation could be satisfied that just maybe it was the end of the beginning. Regardless, the bells rang for the brave Allied troops, for the home front, the government, the hospitals, the WVS, the RAF, the children. They rang for everyone, but not for her.
End of CD 5. CD 6.
Chapter 9. December 1942 to March 1943. Joan. "There's a spot here." Joan pointed to a space next to her that only a waif-like child could slip into. She looked over the shoulders of the other passengers to where Alice slumped, squashed against a handrail near the tube door. "Alice!" she hissed again. Still Alice kept her back turned, but Joan could see her forlorn face thrown back into the carriage from the darkened window. The compressed bodies in their shades of grey and brown shifted, inching themselves into a shape that might be more comfortable. Balancing on her toes, Joan peered through the fissure between 2 arms and focused on Alice's reflection, watching the black walls of the tunnel blur past. Her broad shoulders drooped, her sagging mouth pulled her round cheeks flat against her face. She'd been like this for the best part of a week. The doors opened with a sigh at the Elephant and Castle, and most of the passengers squirmed onto the platform, like worms released from a tin can. Waterloo was the next stop, but Joan swung into the nearest seat, put her bag on her lap, and patted the space next to her. "Come along, Alice," her voice was pleading. "Do you intend to stand the entire way?" Alice turned slowly, moving closer as if she was being forced to do something she loathed. She sat next to Joan without looking at her. The train lurched forward, hesitated, then glided into a tunnel. Joan said, "You've hardly spoken a word since you got back." "I know," Alice said, looking into the darkness again. "I'm getting worried now. It's not like you." "Well, today it might be. I'll have to see how I go." Joan felt impatience building up. The age difference between them suddenly seemed huge. Perhaps this petulant Alice was more true to character than the shy, cheerful Alice everyone thought they knew. "Was it Bristol? Did something dreadful happen that you haven't told me about?" "Old Sodbury," Alice said. "Oh yes, I beg your pardon." Alice had put her right a few times before. "I stand corrected." "Just an ordinary Christmas? Norman were home on leave? I told you all about it. More than you told me about your Christmas." "There's not much to tell, I'm afraid," Joan said, crossing her legs away from Alice and smoothing her skirt over her knees. Hazel, Ivy and me for lunch. Dinner, rather. Very quiet. She kept her eyes on the handle of her bag until the train slowed down for Waterloo. Alice jumped over the gap. Joan unfurled down onto the platform primly, keeping her legs as close together as possible. They walked one behind the other up the escalators and stairs and through the gate into the biting wind blowing from the river. Ploughing ahead, Alice stepped over puddles and shattered paving slabs, around lampposts and sacks of potatoes outside a greengrocery, her glistening waves tucked into the upturned collar of her coat. Joan could imagine her clumping around her parents' small holding, oblivious to the mud and muck, rubber boots and thick green socks on her bare legs, a dog or two running in circles around her, a bunch of carrots in her hand. She did wonder why she was here, when everything about her shouted countryside. Joan skirted the hazards in her path, not wanting to soak her shoes or ladder her stockings. The steady drip of rain was irritating, and when she shook out her hair she knew it would lie flat and stringy, unlike the riotous mass of flattering curls that would frame Alice's face. She stopped under a baker's awning, fiddling with her umbrella until it flowered above her. Joan hadn't expected Alice to wait, so was surprised when a sturdy hand reached under the brolly and grabbed her arm, pulling her to the side of the works entrance. "Listen," Alice said, her breath a mist in the close confines of the waterproof canopy. A spot of saliva curdled in the corner of her mouth. "I doesn't want to fall out over this." "Over what?" Joan said, looking up at Alice. "And I'm telling you because you're my friend." Her face softened. "You are, really, and I want you to stay that way." "As do I," said Joan. "Well, they're all talking about you." She indicated the building site behind her with a cocked thumb. "All of them. Again. They talk about everyone." Joan felt a flush of defensiveness. "They says you're still that old fella's bit of stuff. Cyril what's-his-name where?" Joan shrank from Alice's red accusing face. "And is that what you're saying too?" "Last summer I told them it weren't true," said Alice. "I know. Thank you," Joan said. "I said, an old geezer like him, and a girl like her? Don't be blad. I doesn't say anything this time, though." Alice drew a rough finger across hard-pressed lips. "But I'm not daft, and I can't keep standing up for you because I know you're still carrying on." Joan felt queasy. She thought she'd been so clever. "Of course I'm not." Alice's face told her not to bother with the lie. "How do you know?" Joan asked. "It all adds up." Alice squinted through the anger in her eyes. "All those times you disappear after work, or doesn't show up for a night out, always with some lame excuse or another." "I couldn't tell you, Alice." "No, you couldn't, because you knows it's wrong, and that's why you wouldn't come home with me when I asked." The high colour in Alice's cheeks shone an offended puce. "Isn't it?" "Yes. I'll be honest with you now," Joan said. "Yes, it is. I spent part of Christmas Day with Cyril, but," she said, pulling her shoulders back and mustering herself against Alice's height, "it's not that easy. Adults who feel strongly about one another find it difficult to be apart. You'll find out for yourself one day when you—" Alice drew back sharply, as if she'd been slapped, exposing half her face and head to the rain and wind. "I might be from old Sodbury," she carefully enunciated each syllable of the place name, "and I might be 5 years younger than you, but I know what's what." Joan looked down at the rain seeping through the leather toes of her shoes. "I does." Alice nodded so hard her features smudged into a blur. "And I knows right from wrong. And it's not right what you're up to." "I think we should go in now." Joan tried to manoeuvre around Alice, but Alice moved to bar her way with a firm hand on her arm. "Well, he's one thing," Alice said, her face puckering as if she'd eaten a piece of sour fruit. "Each their own, I suppose." Her voice softened a bit. "Maybe you does love him and all that." Joan didn't pass comment. Being in love might be enough to excuse her behaviour in Alice's view of life, but as she was making an attempt at honesty, she couldn't have named the feeling she had for Cyril as love. At least, not in the same way she'd been in love with Ralph. "But those things you sell, for him, you're still at it, aren't you?" Alice folded her arms and leaned back on her hip. "Gwen and Olive asked me if I were in on it, if I could get this, that and the other for them." Joan couldn't meet Alice's eyes. She looked instead at her mouth, the moist lips twitching. She told the others that it was she alone who could provide them with shampoo, soap, sugar, tea, gravy browning. "I'm the only one who can help you," she'd said, "so don't bother asking anyone else." The little treat she'd left around Hazel's hostel had stopped too, so she'd thought she'd covered her tracks from Alice, who'd been devastated when she'd first found out what Joan was doing. "Why?" Alice said, so close to her face that Joan could feel droplets of moist, warm spray landing on her cheeks. "None of us gots everything we want, but we gots enough, except for you. Why do you need more of them little things than anyone else? Or more lolly?" She stopped and drew her head back to take in more of Joan. Then she nodded. "Oh, I knows. It's to keep you in good with that Cyril bloke." She stepped back and took a deep breath. "I didn't know many fancy words before I met you," she said, "but I does now, and I think it's despicable." She pushed the umbrella aside and made for the changing rooms. I should tell her, Joan thought. Tell her everything. About Ralph and how Cyril reminds me of him. Tell her that I throw myself at anything that Mother would hate me for. Make her understand that none of it is my fault. "Alice, wait!" But Alice didn't, and Joan stood by herself watching fat drops of rain quiver on the rim of her umbrella, then slip off into the oily puddles at her feet. A thumbs up from Alice. Joan pulled the brake in the cab and watched as the planks were released and set down ready for collection. Alice was talking to a couple of women who hovered nearby, lining up lengths of wood. She gesticulated a lot when she talked. Perhaps that was why her communications with Joan from below the crane were so accurate, or had the need to talk with her hands for work become part of her essence. Surely everything one experienced changed one in some way, she reasoned with herself. When Alice had first realised Joan was involved with Cyril and his black marketeering, she told Joan what she'd thought of her. "I didn't see it at first," she told at her, as if she felt personally betrayed. "I thought you were ever so nice, but you're sly, sneaky and underhand." When Joan thought about it, she could see that she might be everything Alice indicted her for, but she could not agree that Cyril or his cheap little business were the causes of her shifty deviousness. That had started a long time ago, with Mother. One of the women said something that made Alice laugh, her wide smile pushing her cheeks up under her eyes. How lovely to be Alice, Joan thought. Natural, honest, open. A new score of music waiting to be played. No one gossiped about Alice, because there was nothing to blather about. How could anyone find fault with her easy manner, her wonder at whatever she saw, her enthusiasm and energy? Some of the others loved to rib her about her dialect, but it wasn't vindictive, and had ingrained itself into the everyday workings of the bridge. Most days, impressions of her Bristolian burr could be heard in passing from workers they hardly knew. Blushing in general had also been attributed to Alice. Whenever anyone reddened out of bashfulness or embarrassment, they were asked if they'd changed their name to Alice. A hand signalled that the crane should be lifted, another to say the way was clear for grabbing a load of timber. It was a relief that when she was working the controls in the cab, she could not allow herself to think of anything else. When the arm was at its apex, she pulled the lever and raised the hook gracefully, like an inverted question mark, towards the next waiting load. Pedestrians were using the far side of the roadway now, and Joan could see them on her periphery, through the windscreen wipers, heads down, hurrying with purpose across the river. Alice stopped her with the flat of her palm and shifted the lengths of wood onto the hook. She checked the rope for strength, and when she was satisfied, motioned for Joan to lift. 3 more loads followed until Alice chopped the air with her hand. Break time. They worked well together. When Joan looked back, she felt ashamed to remember that when she'd first met Alice, she thought her no more than a yokel, unsophisticated and provincial. Quickly she'd added naive, unworldly, and green to that opinion. Now here she was, envious of those same traits she renamed as innocent, sincere, reliable, straightforward, perceptive and discerning. What she once thought negative characteristics, she now perceived as sterling qualities, and wished life had allowed her to develop in the same way. Following behind Alice and her two companions, as they made their way to the canteen, Joan wondered what Alice's mother was like. Ma, Alice called her. Nothing like Mother, Joan assured herself, or else she wouldn't have had a daughter like Alice. A few days after Mother had delivered her violin to Hazel's hostel, Joan had answered Alice's persistent questions by saying that Mother had been unhappy about her leaving home. Alice looked away but didn't say anything. Joan wondered if Alice's ma hadn't wanted her to go away either, but not for the same selfish reasons as her own mother. Probably it was simply that she would miss the girl so much. She would have liked to ask Alice more about her ma and her life at home, but knew she would then be expected to offer information of her own in exchange. At knocking-off time, Alice plonked herself down on the bench next to where Joan was changing, putting her belt on a peg, loosening her turban. Patting her fine wisps of hair, Joan could tell that her earlier prediction had been correct. The style had flagged and lay listless against her head. She pulled a comb through it, trying to force a wave or two, and pinned it behind her ears. Alice smiled across at her. "It suits you like that," she said. "Off your forehead." "Thank you, Alice." The formal tone in her voice made her cringe. "Are you meeting?" "Yes," Joan said, determined to sound enthusiastic. "I am." "See you sometime later at Hazel's, then." She was going to meet Cyril, but not until later. Somewhere to sit was what she needed, and a bit of time on her own. There was a Lyons on the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street, where she could probably find a table at the back, away from the clatter and chatter. A square of apple something was on the plate in front of her. She took a bite from the corner and couldn't decide what it was. It remained apple something. At least the tea was good, strong and hot. Her table was crammed into a corner next to the swinging service doors. Her view was of a wall, flocked burgundy wallpaper below the picture rail, a photo of the outside of the shop above. This sort of setting was not unusual to her. Cyril would think this secreted spot, with its bleak outlook, perfect for one of their encounters. Where else did they go besides darkened corners and shabby deserted clubs frequented by other couples hiding away like them? What else did Cyril do except look over his shoulder and start whenever a door opened or a dark-haired woman came towards them on the street? During the summer, they'd met a few times at some stop along the Green Line and had a drink sitting outside a country pub. They'd wandered across fields and through copses, stopping to eat their picnic on a rough blanket. Cyril had squashed into a holdall. Then they'd made love in the open, hidden by trees and foliage. She'd wanted Cyril as much as he'd wanted her, but if it hadn't been for the thrill of imagining Mother's reaction if she knew, each time would have been a disenchanting anticlimax. The way the light dappled through the tree branches, illuminating first the tops, then the undersides of the swaying leaves, was much more interesting than what Cyril was doing, or trying to do to her. She thought she'd feel the way she had with Ralph. Extraordinary, different, the centre of the world. But Cyril hadn't taken the time and trouble that Ralph had. She only knew it was over when he lay still and started to talk about what he would have for her to sell the following week. There was hardly a damp patch to wipe from between her legs. It was more difficult for them to be alone, as Cyril called it, now that winter had set in. Once or twice they'd used his cousin's place in Kenton or taken a B&B as a married couple. Those times had been a little better, Cyril making it plain he felt less rushed or pressurised indoors. Joan hadn't thought about it this way before, but the same problems would have arisen with Ralph had they not had his offices at the hall to retreat to. A few times they, also, had found some furtive hidey-hole where they could have a drink and gaze into each other's eyes. Those occasions had been magical to Joan, and she truly believed that Ralph had felt the same. Lately, she'd been listening with what felt like a tinge of envy to some of her co-workers laughing and talking about arranging to meet man-friends in public places like cinemas and museums, having dates with officers in well-lit restaurants, dancing in crowded ballrooms with their arms wrapped around all manner of strong shoulders, without having to worry about who might see and report them to unassuming wives. Could Mother have been right? Was Ralph nothing more than a Svengali? The thought caused her such physical pain that she could not pursue it. She could perhaps accept that title for Cyril, but not for Ralph. She asked a passing Nippy for another cup of tea. When it arrived, she stirred it so vigorously that the spoon, when she let it go, was caught in a vortex and circled the cup a couple of times of its own accord. She was quite sure she didn't love Cyril, and probably didn't like him either. He had reminded her in some vague ways of Ralph, and illogical as it was, she had thought he would prove to be very like him. But then, Mother wouldn't have thought that out of character. Her latest letter to Joan had said as much. "I do firmly believe, Joan dear, that you're not thinking straight. If only you'd come home and let me help you take up the strings again." Joan couldn't remember the rest verbatim, but it went on and on in the same vein. Draining her tea, she made up her mind about Cyril. Tonight, she would give him the heave-ho. Joan looked at her watch. Cyril would be waiting for her in the doorway of the Coach and Horses, squinting occasionally from the shadows to scan the street, not for her, but for anyone who might give him away. She pressed a serviette to her lips, then dropped it on top of the apple something. Peeking in the mirror of her powder compact to refresh her lipstick, she thought she looked less drawn and preoccupied, and put the palpable changes down to the decision she'd made. Cyril's mood was lighter than it had been for ages, and Joan found herself enjoying his company. Perhaps, she thought, she'd been a bit too hasty. He kept his hand firm around her waist, pulling her close, stroking her hands and ears. Sitting at the end of the bar, furthest from the door, they talked about an air raid that had fallen just short of the bridge. "I do hope it's not starting up again," Joan winced. "That horrid bombing, night after night." Cyril laughed, touching her hair with a fingertip. "Don't you worry about that. Jerry's busy elsewhere." "How can you be so sure?" she asked. Tapping the side of his nose, Cyril said, "Would I lie to you?" She raised her eyebrows and looked at him from under them. "Probably," she said. "You lie to everyone else." He feigned hurt, his bottom lip protruding in a pout. "You're the exception," he said, linking his little finger around hers. "Now, I have some exciting news." "Oh?" Joan wondered what it could be. Perhaps his wife was going away for a few days, and he was going to invite her to play house, or he'd sniffed out another flat they could use for an hour or two on a Sunday. She could hear herself agreeing to the arrangement, despite her better judgment of earlier. "Spam," he mouthed the word, and then smiled, pleased with himself. "Pardon me?" She could see the tiny black hairs on his nose and a brilliantine shine on his moustache as he leaned closer to her and whispered, "Spam." Joan pictured turning the key around the blue tin with yellow lettering, the pale pink slab of meat laced with ashen blobs of lard slithering in pallid aspic onto a plate. She could smell the spitting grease permeating the kitchen, finding its way into wardrobes, hair, cushions, drying laundry. Even so, when she thought of the taste, her mouth watered. "Spam," she said, "is not exciting." "To many people," Cyril said. "Spam is a banquet. I've seen you tuck in with relish a number of times." "Needs must," she said, remembering the fritter sandwiches they'd shared in the woods last summer. "Exactly," Cyril relaxed back. "If it's needed, then it's a must, and musts will always sell." "Oh, Cyril," Joan groaned, "you're not telling me. Not Spam." "I can start you off with 3 dozen, he said, as if he were doing her a favour, "and there'll be plenty more when that's gone." "Cyril," she withdrew her hand from his tinkering fingers, "I've been intending to tell you something for ages." His arm slipped from around her back. He fiddled with his tie. "Had enough of me, have you?" He looked into his whiskey before putting the glass to his lips. For a moment, Joan felt pulled in 2 directions, but decided she wasn't quite ready to give up on him yet. "No, not you," Joan said. "This selling business." "I thought you were game for it," he said, lowering his voice and spitting out the words. "When we first met, you said you didn't care what you did or what people thought of you. Let them talk, you said. I couldn't care less." That was true, Joan thought. She had said that, or words to that effect. And at the time she'd meant them. He was staring at her, challenging her. She wouldn't tell him about Alice or her feelings of moral reprehension. He'd laugh at her, Never let her forget it. "Well," she said, "that was before there was a fine involved. A monkey, I think I've heard you call it." He snorted. "I know all about that." He leaned into her again. "Do you think they'd ever come after a young lady like you?" "I'm not prepared to take the chance," she said. "You don't pay me near enough to cover the fine, if it came to it, so all in all, it's not worth the bother." A few minutes of silence passed. Cyril pointed to his empty glass, and the landlord brought him another. "Yes or no?" he asked Joan, indicating her drink. "Yes, please," Joan said. After he paid, Cyril went out to turn his bike around, as he put it. He lit them both a cigarette when he came back and said, "I understand, my dear. But do you honestly think I'd put my darling in the way of any danger?" "I certainly like to think not," Joan said. "Whisper in my ear how much of the stuff you have left." Joan had to calculate. Her large work-bag was full, and there was a fair amount stashed away in her bedroom. Cyril nodded when she told him what she could remember being left of each item. He looked thoughtful, counting on his fingers, his mouth working as he reckoned the numbers. "I tell you what, Joni," he said. "Sell that lot for me and I'll give you 25%. There won't be any need to worry. I'll cover for you as I've done all along anyway. Then that'll be the end of it. What do you say?" Joan found herself nodding in agreement to what felt like a compromise. With one swift calculating look around the pub, Cyril pulled her to him and kissed her hard. The tatty treasure seemed to fly out of her hands. She didn't want to say anything to Alice until she'd stopped completely, but let it be known to her regulars that her bag was not bottomless, and before long they'd have to look elsewhere for their little extras. The news, she knew, would soon spread to Alice's ears, and she would be pacified. By the middle of February, every last item was gone, as was the German Sixth Army from Stalingrad. There was a subtle, infectious shift of mood, initiated by newscasters and radio announcers, spread by newspaper reports and epic Pathé bulletins. Evelyn, whose dad seemed to know about military strategy, said the turning point had come, but he was advising Winnie to keep at it and not get carried away with excitement yet. The cold was incomprehensible to Joan, watching the news from a cosy cinema seat during one of the warmest Februaries she'd ever experienced. No wonder there was no snow in London. By the looks of it, the world's quota for that winter had fallen on Stalingrad. It had crippled soldiers on both sides, that and hunger. How they'd kept going was a mystery to her, but somehow the Red Army had battled through, running from building to building, defending a pile of bricks to the death. Steel-hearted, the press called them. They never gave up, and now they had victory. The Allies had victory in Russia. The poor souls, they stared vacantly at her from the screen, until their beleaguered eyes shifted and the wounds from deep within surfaced. She hoped they thought it was worth it. The government certainly did, seconding the Albert Hall for a salute to the Red Army. Eden gave a speech, poems were recited, military formations displayed. Joan's orchestra from the hall played throughout. No, she corrected herself, it was no longer hers, thank goodness. She and Alice crouched next to their crane sharing a ciggy, listening to Evelyn read aloud a newspaper article about the event. "They might have got some better music," Evelyn said. "You know, something a bit livelier." Joan laughed and said, "Not all classical music is a dirge." "Oh well," Evelyn put on a toff's accent and flicked her finger under her nose. "I wouldn't know, I'm sure." "Have you heard them play then, Joan?" Alice asked. "Once or twice. A long time ago," Joan said. "I love music." Alice was watching her carefully. "Were it good?" Joan shrugged. "Yes," she said. "Very professional." "Let's celebrate ourselves," Evelyn said, tossing the paper aside. "It's only Wednesday," Alice said. "I don't know if I'm up to it." "Oh, don't be such an old frosty knickers," Evelyn said. "Let's go and see what the Yanks are up to in Piccadilly. You know you love it there." Alice blushed. She did like the GIs, and they seemed to think a lot of her. She told Joan she could picture herself in a sprawling house in Florida or California, maybe Texas. Joan didn't have the heart to tell her that the Yanks who went for her were from farming states like Idaho and Wisconsin, probably seeing in Alice the physique and fortitude for getting up at the crack of dawn to milk cows or drive a tractor. "Maybe for a little while," she said. "Joan?" Evelyn asked, pulverising her cigarette butt with her boot. "Or have you got something else on?" "Yes," Joan said. "I have." Alice smiled at her behind Evelyn's back. Joan had told her that her business dealings with Cyril were over. Alice had been so pleased that Joan was sure she'd made the right decision. She'd got what she wanted, for once. A bit of self-respect, deference from Alice, the freedom to meet Cyril with a clean conscience, and Mother would be horrified with all of it. She waited for Cyril in one of their usual backwaters off Trafalgar Square, pressing herself into the dark away from the door of the club, avoiding a patch of sticky beer on the pavement. Big Ben chimed, and she checked her watch against the 8 tolls. She poked her head out and looked up and down the street. It wasn't like Cyril to be late. G sharp, F sharp, E, B, for the quarter hour, variations on a theme for the half hour, and quarter to. She stood motionless and listened to the cycle repeat itself, da capo al fine. Groups and couples came out, who had noticed her as they went in. A man in a brown trilby said something to the woman he was with as they walked away. Then they both turned, looked her up and down, and burst into laughter. She waited until the hammer struck the great bell 10 times before catching the tube home and creeping into her room. She didn't want to chance Hazel hearing and dragging her into the sitting room for a chat with Mummy. Under the bedclothes, fully dressed, she hugged herself tight. Joan was sure Alice must have put 2 and 2 together and realised Cyril had thrown her over when she'd given his dodgy dealings the push. After all, Alice wasn't daft, as she told Joan a few months earlier. The younger girl didn't say anything, though, going along with the vague notion Joan mentioned about her and Cyril tiring of each other. A couple of times Alice made to comfort her by saying, "I felt the same before I came here when..." or, "In old Sodbury there were..." But Joan stopped her short each time. "No need to feel sorry for me," she'd say. "I'm more than glad to be out of that situation." Alice would adapt the embrace she'd been aiming for into a pat on the back and say, "That's proper then." During the following weeks, Joan's upset and humiliation turned into anger. She so wanted to give Cyril a piece of her mind, practising what she would say if only she could locate him. His wife, if she opened the door when Joan called at Cyril's unknown address, would hear every dirty detail, and Joan would make damn sure she understood that Cyril had been voracious for every bit of her. Cyril, if she could corner him, would be made to hear how contemptible he was, and she would threaten him with the police. "Who do you think they'd believe?" she'd snarl at him. "A poor innocent girl or a middle-aged spiv like you?" She asked questions and found out that he was training crane handlers on the docks, but she couldn't find him, no matter what time of day she wanted past the locks and keys. Hoping to see him, she regularly hung around places she'd heard him mention, betting shops and drinking pubs, Petticoat Lane and Smithfields, but he continued to elude her. She took to skimming faces and heads in crowds, quickly examining shoes and the cut of trousers, glancing over silhouettes in profile. He must be lying low or skirting around the perimeters of human existence like a rat. A few times she thought she spotted him and made to follow, but was thwarted when the suspect showed himself to be an innocent stranger. At finishing time on a fresh and breezy early spring evening, Joan and Alice surged with 100 or so other workers onto the south side of the river. Joan was pursuing her habit of scrutinising passers-by while listening to Alice relating something Olive had said about what she wore under her bib and braces. And there, disappearing around a corner, she caught a glimpse of the familiar stride of a straight leg, the confident flapping of an overcoat vent, shoes polished to a lustre. Cyril's brisk, jaunty walk filled her with rage. She was sure she could hear his thin whistle, spewing out some cheap music hall number above the noise of the crowd. How dare he be so sure of himself, she thought, so carefree. Ignoring Alice's shout, she shoved and elbowed her way to the side street he'd disappeared down. Coming out of the dark alleyway, she caught sight of him again and raised her hands to frame a bellow of his name. Then he bounced across the road, waved to a tall woman holding a little girl's hand, and bent to kiss both of them. Joan stared, her hands dropping to her sides. "Don't be wet," she told herself. "Now's your chance." She watched as he took his child's hand, draped his arm around his wife's shoulder, led them along the street, and opened the door of a cafe for them. Let him go, she thought. He's not worth the effort. And you, Mrs. Ware, are welcome to him. Chapter 10. April to July 1943. Evelyn. Dad found it difficult to understand Evelyn's interest in the Wes, and had no hesitation in telling her what he thought every time she mentioned attending a meeting or a talk. He looked at her with uncharacteristic suspicion and asked, "What is it again? This thing you're going to?" "The Wes. I've told you so many times already. There's a lecture on technical terms for unqualified building workers." "Wes. What does it stand for? Wesley someone?" Evelyn composed her features into the sort of disappointed glare she might once have turned on a trying child in her classroom. "It's the Women's Engineering Society," Sylvie said, sitting next to Dad at the rickety kitchen table. "Women's?" Dad rubbed his chin. "That's the bit I don't get," he said. "Women's?" "I wish now I'd never said anything. I thought you'd be pleased, like you were when I was teaching." "Your attitude's a real turn-up for the books," Sylvie said, tearing a mouldy corner off her slice of toast and waving it in Dad's direction. "We never thought you were so old-fashioned." "Give over, you two." Dad held his hands up in surrender. "Stop ganging up on me." "How does Alec put it, Sylvie?" Evelyn said. "You ain't seen nothing yet." She raised an eyebrow and scraped her chair in Dad's direction. "No, sir, you haven't," Sylvie said, following Evelyn's lead and inching her way towards Dad until they'd trapped him between the table and kitchen cupboard. His back against the wall. There they both attacked his armpits with their nails until the three of them were laughing hard and the atmosphere was back to its usual unclouded amiability. Kissing Dad's forehead, Sylvie picked up the remainder of her toast and said, "Right, I'm off." "See you tonight, love." Dad mopped his eyes and nose with a handkerchief. "And I'll see you later on the bridge," Sylvie said, "if the ogre allows you out." "Oi, enough cheek from you," Dad called after her. Evelyn added her dishes to Sylvie's in the sink, leaving them to be washed after tea, when enough had amassed to justify boiling a kettle full of water and using a pinch of their precious 3 ounces of soap flakes. When Dad got his breath back, he said, "I'm sorry, love. I don't want you to think I'm behind the times, but I suppose I am." Evelyn sat to face Dad over the table. "What are you worried about, Dad?" Dad let out a weary sigh that culminated in a rapid flapping and slapping of his lips. "I don't know, love. What don't I worry about? That might be easier to answer." Evelyn grasped Dad's knotted fingers, rubbing the rough spots, caressing the calluses. "Haven't we done okay, Dad? Aren't we good girls like Mum wanted us to be?" Dad nodded. "So far. But I worry about that sister of yours. I don't want her to get herself, you know." He pointed to his round belly and whispered, "Pregnant. Not even by Alec. Not before there's a ring on her finger." Evelyn smiled. "Alec's an honourable man," she said. "There. Is that old-fashioned enough for you?" I know." Dad scooted a teaspoon across the table, then back again. "But honour isn't always enough to stop people getting up to a bit of how's your father. Not when there's a war on." He pinched Evelyn's cheek, brushed a loose curl behind her ear. "I'm a foolish old bugger," he said. "You certainly are," Evelyn said. "But we've grown rather fond of you all the same." "It's just that everything's changing so quickly. I'm getting left behind." Dad worried at a mark on the tablecloth. "I know I am." "Not you, Dad," Evelyn said. "You know more about what's going on than men half your age. Whenever we're talking at work about this campaign or that raid, everyone asks what you think and what pointers you'd give Winnie."
Do they?
Dad sat up a bit straighter, his eyes widening. I can't imagine why, though, being as you're such a balmy old geezer.
That's the side of me I only show to you lot. But this engineering lark you keep on about.
He shook his head. It's just an interest. There's no harm in it. I could be doing a lot worse.
But it's all women. However will you meet a husband like that?
Evelyn laughed aloud, but couldn't bring herself to tell her father that what she found funny was the idea that the only thing to aim for was finding a husband. That, and not getting pregnant by your husband-to-be until he was your husband. Dad's fleshy-lined face fell.
Mum used to say kids and a home were what made women happy. And a good man.
Well, she wasn't wrong. And she found one of the best, didn't she?
We got along okay, he said. I'd like some of the same for you.
Now, Evelyn thought, might be the perfect time to tell Dad about Stan. The way things were going between them, she would have to introduce him to her family soon. And it would allay Dad's fears about her missing the boat as far as men and relationships were concerned. But something held her back, and instead she said, There's plenty of time for all that, and you're right. Things are changing. I wouldn't mind betting that before too long women will be able to have a proper job and be married both at the same time. Even teachers. Dad groaned, his head in his hands. Evelyn covered his tea with the plate and put it on top of a saucepan of water. Start it off 20 minutes before you want to eat. She blew him a kiss. See you tonight. Holding tight to the safety pole on the packed bus, Evelyn forced herself to think about Stan rather than the Wes and the bridge. Despite herself, she smiled when a picture of him came into her mind. Of all the glamorous places she could have met someone, a late-night club, a bar with dimmed, hazy lighting, a hotel restaurant that served high teas, a shared taxi ride, she had met Stan at a bus stop. It had been late. A cold wind was blowing, and her feet hurt from dancing when she tagged onto the queue waiting for the last bus. The catch on her much-loved patent handbag was tricky, and she was rather more brutal with it than she should have been.
Careful, a deep voice said. You'll ruin the whole mechanism going at it like that. Not to mention your good looks by grinding your jaw.
Evelyn was not in the mood for banter, but when she looked up it was to see the face of a young man in RAF uniform grinning at her. Despite herself, she smiled.
Stan,
the young man said in a low voice.
Here, would you like me to have a look at that for you?
Without missing a beat, Evelyn said, Good luck, and handed over the bag. Stan studied the intricacies of the catch, looking at it first from one angle, then another. Evelyn studied Stan.
Ah, he said, peering at her through long eyelashes. Do you see this minute pin here?
She looked to where he was pointing, and their heads almost touched over the open interior of the bag. She said. I think so.
Well,
Stan turned the bag so they could see the clasp from the other side.
The same thing should be here, but it's missing. So the two parts won't meet and click together.
With one hand he held the straps, and the other he placed with great care underneath the bulging material and handed the bag back to her. Oh, I see, she said, and sighed. I suppose I shall have to give this one up, more's the pity.
A favourite, I'm guessing?
Yes, indeed, she said. We've had many a good night out together.
Then don't be too hasty, Stan said, the smile never slipping from his face. How about we cut a bargain?
Evelyn grinned, her eyes wide. I'm always on the lookout for a good deal, she said playfully.
If you and your handbag agree to meet me for a dance next Friday, I'll bring the small part and fix it for you on the spot.
He held out his hand.
Shake on it.
It's a deal, she said, and his dry, well-manicured fingers were firm to the touch. This is mine. She pointed to the bus moving towards them, and felt an unsettling moment of disappointment to be saying goodbye.
Friday evening, then, Stan said. Shall we say 7, outside Tottenham Court Road Station?
Yes, Evelyn nodded. Thank you. I'll look forward to it.
And me, Stan said.
The bus pulled into the curb, and Stan took her elbow and guided her toward the open door. But her heart sank when she became aware of his limp. She doubted he'd make a good dance partner. Evelyn wished she hadn't accepted his invitation quite so quickly, and wondered what she could offer as an excuse to save his embarrassment. She thought Stan must have been aware of her quandary because he said, "Do you like riddles?" Evelyn tilted her head to one side and was about to ask what he meant when he carried on. "Most people do, so here's one for you. How does an RAF mechanic with a rather pronounced limp dance?" Evelyn laughed and repeated the question back to him, like she'd done with riddles as a child. "Give up?" Stan asked. Then, without giving her a chance to answer, he said, "Very well indeed." That made Evelyn laugh yet again. "I think I'm going to hold you to that." "Good. I have a feeling I'm going to enjoy being held to things by you." As the bus pulled away, they waved to each other, and Evelyn watched Stan limp back towards the queue, his half-smile still in place. They'd spent quite a few lovely evenings together since then. Evelyn had been asked to have tea with his mum, dad and younger sister above the ironmonger shop they owned in Sidcup. It had been very nice, and they'd made her welcome, but their quiet affability lacked something that she couldn't at first describe to herself. Thinking about the afternoon later, she decided that they didn't display the fun that she associated with her own family. Or perhaps she hadn't given them a chance before coming to that conclusion. After all, most families were on their best behaviour when someone new was in their midst. Well, families who didn't have Sylvie amongst their number. There was also something about their quiet assumption that Stan would take over the running of the shop, and that any woman he married would be happy to help in an assistant's capacity, as his mum seemed to have been. That grated on her in the same way as the old overridden law that women had to give up teaching when they married, and unequal pay, and the fact women couldn't readily take up any career they wanted. It was all so unfair. She wanted to stamp her feet in frustration. Stan hadn't seen any action, but had been based at RAF Abingdon, near Oxford, fixing planes like he'd mended her handbag, until some piece of machinery had mangled his foot. When it healed as much as it was going to, he had been sent back to the airfield to work in the stockrooms, so it had not been difficult to see him when he was home on leave, and then to carry on going out with Sylvie and the others when he was posted. Something inside her had pulled tight, and she'd felt a pang of guilt and pity for Stan when she'd introduced him to Sylvie and Alec as her friend. For a split second, she'd noticed a look of disbelief pass over his face, as when they were alone, they were becoming more and more intimate. When they were next by themselves, Evelyn expected Stan to say something about their friendship, but he didn't address the situation, so neither did she. But Evelyn could not figure out why she'd asked Sylvie not to mention Stan to Dad yet, or to any of their friends on the bridge, other than Gwen in passing. She always looked forward to seeing him, at this very moment, wedged amongst others on the clammy bus, with one woman's muddy raincoat brushing her legs and another's shoes dangerously close to her toes. She smiled when she thought about him, and wondered which dance hall they would end up in tonight. Perhaps she thought she liked him so much that she wanted to keep him all to herself for a little longer, like a secret bar of chocolate you know you should share but can't quite bring yourself to do so. Yes, it wasn't that she didn't think enough of him, it was that she liked him too much. And there was, after all, so much about him to like. The same 10 girls, including Evelyn, were present at this second talk in a series of 6. For the opening lecture, they'd sat in 2 rows facing the front and listened to a lady architect talk about blueprints, those oily waxed sheets of paper she'd seen being thrown about and pored over in Jim's hut. She showed them how one page layered over another in a typical house plan: foundations, exterior elevations, detailed floor charts, sewerage, electrics, piping, interior walls, staircases, utilities, roofing. After the break, she ran through a basic list of symbols and abbreviations that accompanied the plans and how to read the scale. All of that in an hour and a half. This time, the chairs were arranged in a circle around a small wooden table. Evelyn took a seat and opened the notebook she brought with her. Lecture notes hadn't been provided last time, and she'd felt self-conscious sitting and listening while everyone around her was scribbling furiously. More to the point, the only thing she'd been able to remember when she left the Wes Club room empty-handed and empty-headed was that on a blueprint there is 1/8 of an inch to a foot of constructed material. She'd have to do better than that. Pencil sharpened and ready, Evelyn nodded to a few girls she recognised. None of them were on the bridge, so she wondered where they worked and what they were involved in building. A smart woman, wearing a white coat that gave her the appearance of a doctor, carried the shell of a miniature house into the middle of the room. Her light brown hair was tied back. Pencils, pens, and a protractor protruded from the top of her breast pocket. Puffing, she placed the model on the table and took it apart into pieces, leaving nothing but the base. "There, that's that," she said, clapping the dust off her hands. She looked younger when she stood tall and smiled around the circle. Pointing to Evelyn and the girl next to her, she asked if they'd fetched the 2 boxes she'd left by the door. "Shouldn't be too much for you," she said, flexing her arm. "Working on the tools all day?" The boxes were cumbersome, pieces of what looked like doll's house furniture rattling around inside them. "Just here, girls." The woman pointed next to her. "Well done." She marched around the room, lifting the heavy curtains away from their ornate hanging poles to check the blackouts were secured, turning up the lamps, talking all the while. "My name is Cynthia Blackwood. I'm an engineer, or as the chaps like to refer to me, a lady engineer." As if the description is necessary. Never mind, there aren't many of us, so seeing all of you here this evening is heartening. I'm going to be with you for the next 5 talks. And this, she said, pointing to the pieces of replica house, will be with us too. Come, she beckoned with both hands, moving closer so you can see properly. Evelyn carried her chair forward, forming a tight ring with the others. She felt pleased that Cynthia would be their tutor for the remainder of the lecture series. Not that there had been anything to complain about with the previous woman, but in comparison, she'd seemed aloof, inaccessible, as if her knowledge kept her apart from her audience. No such barrier seemed to exist between Cynthia and the snug circle. She made them feel they had equal standing in a somewhat secretive society. "We," Cynthia said, "are going to build a house. No words allowed like thingamajig, what's its name, or ask the gaffer. We're going to use the correct vocabulary as we go along. Where shall we start?" "Foundations," said a girl with fair hair and long red nails. "All agreed?" Cynthia asked. Everyone nodded. "Excellent." The older woman took a piece from one of the boxes. "Spread footings extend beyond the frost line. Good enough for shallow foundations. Deep foundations will need reinforced concrete. Just listen and join in for now. I've notes to give you at the end." The door was closed, the room warm, the energy fixated on Mrs. Blackwood, her facsimile and the information she was so willing to impart. Within that confined, intimate space, Evelyn felt as though she'd chanced into a limitless expanse. No one on the bridge knew about Evelyn's after-hours involvement in the Wes, and Sylvie had sworn to keep her cake-hole closed for once, or twice, counting keeping Mum about Stan. So during the following week, Evelyn read through her notes, trying to familiarise herself with the technical terms by referring in her mind to things she saw on the bridge, using their correct names. The sides became the facings. The gas was now an acetylene flame. Sand and gravel were aggregates. Concrete cylinders that agitated both ways were reversing or tilting drum mixers. Wherever she moved around the site, Evelyn made a note of what she saw and the way in which it was being used, how each segment fitted with the next. One afternoon, she let something slip about the beamed deck to Olive and a couple of her cronies, who ribbed her endlessly about it. "Your training with the gaffer's gone to your head, Gil," Olive said. "What's a beamed deck when you're at home?" Evelyn hid her embarrassment by joining in. "I haven't got a clue. Something I heard one of the blokes say." She took a deep draw on the end of her cigarette. "Thought it sounded good." "Bloody hell," Olive said, digging a splinter out of the palm of her hand. "You're a beamed deck if you ask me." From the north side of the bridge, the grief-stricken moan of a klaxon broke through the constant din of machinery, stopping their banter. Jim tore across the unopened section of the roadway, his unfastened faded blue work coat fanning out behind him. 3 other men with first aid training joining him on the way to the Somerset end. Hauling equipment and tools from their path, workers flattened themselves out of the way. Traffic noise slowed. In the distance, an ambulance sounded, the beating of its bell intensifying before it came to a halt. Olive scratched the top of one boot with the toe of the other, scuffing the leather. They stood and watched the cigarette butt Evelyn flicked into the wind hover for a second, then spiral away from them and down over the facings to the Thames. Heavy clouds hung so low that Evelyn thought she would be able to reach up and squeeze the rain out of them. "Best round my lot up and get on," Evelyn said. "Your crew still dismantling?" Olive asked. Evelyn nodded. "I swear that old bridge grows bits of itself back overnight. Whatever we take down during the day reappears the next. We'll never get rid of it." "Like one of them lizard things," one of Olive's friends said. "You know, if you catch hold of it, it sheds its tail and then hides away till it grows another." Olive looked at her as if she'd gone mad. "Where does this happen, then?" She nodded towards Evelyn. "On her beamed deck?" Olive always had to have the final say, and Evelyn had to admit it was always witty. "I came over looking for Gwen, actually," she said. "Seen her today." "She's in, but she don't seem herself," Olive said, glancing in the direction of the accident. "A bit clumsy. You know, away with the fairies." "At least she's here. I'll come back across at dinner time to see her. Tell her for me, won't you?" Evelyn descended to the gantry that connected the new bridge to the partly demolished temporary structure. She'd been backwards and forwards countless times, but always ran her hands along the railings, knowing how easy it would be to get cocky and lose her footing. Safety had been one of the facets John covered in his training for the new foremen and women, and Evelyn was so aware of hazards and pitfalls now that she had become a bit of a nag. Sylvie and Gwen, when they were with her, suffered the main brunt of her warnings. Gwen in particular was a worry. Her hands were in a bad way again, ulcerated sores around the cuticles, her nails so bitten back that angry inflamed patches of skin were exposed to the elements. She was thin and vulnerable, almost scraggy after failing to regain the weight she had lost during her bout of flu. Distracted too, lifeless and listless. She'd had countless days off, every other day some weeks, or 2 days on, 1 day off. Jim was doing his best to accommodate her, but some of the others were grumbling, wondering why they couldn't come and go as they pleased, even though Gwen had her pay docked every time she was off without a doctor's note. The girls who worked under Evelyn drained their flasks and stamped on their roll-ups, collected their tools and set to work when she gave them the OK. They were a good bunch, on time most days, easy to talk to, not resentful of Evelyn as she thought they might be. As well as hard work, a lot of singing, swearing and good-humoured teasing went on in Evelyn's gang. The work was nothing new, though. This is what she and Sylvie had been doing when they started, around the time that photographer had snapped their photo that never did appear in the newspaper. Then they were welding reinforcing rods together, nailing lengths of timber. Now the men were taking the steel work apart, and the women were cutting the rods into more easily transportable lengths. As for the huge steel girders, Evelyn thought she heard Jim say they would be used somewhere on the front. Good. Double the war effort from the bridge. Evelyn pulled her shield down and watched what each girl was doing in turn, checking the colour of their flames, ensuring there were plenty of empty flatbed trolleys on which to load the sets of reinforcements. When she was satisfied, she took up her own station and began to score through a steel rod, the molten metal melting away from either side of a clean slash. She'd got what Jim promised her. She was forewoman of a gang of 6. But she'd hoped for something more glamorous, though it seemed a strange contradictory term to use when it came to building work. Sliding her safety shield onto her head, she did a quick round of her group again, giving a thumbs up to one of the girls who looked up at the same time. The job she'd wanted was across the temporary bridge, beyond the chasm into the river, over the expanse of the opened half of the new roadway, to where gangs of men were working along the far opposite facing of the new structure. At road level, they were fixing reeded cornice bands onto the outer surfaces, a lovely piece of work. Others were setting up fixtures for lighting standards, putting railings in place. Those sorts of jobs required responsibility and the chance to use spirit levels, to read plans, to make decisions. But all of it was being carried out by men. She and the 3 other girls promoted to 4 women were each given a measuring tape and put here, back where they started. Dare she complain to Jim again? She pictured trying to explain her gripe to him, heard herself stumbling over the wrong words, could see his hurt, bemused face. If Jim did understand her grievances and transferred her to head a task on the new bridge, there were no qualified women to work under her. Leading a group of men would be impossible. Besides, her condensed training sessions didn't certify her to take on those more intricate, specialised duties. She'd have to be a lady engineer to get in there, and even then, that might not be enough. Above her, a crane load of reinforcements swayed, waiting to be guided down. Taking off her gauntlets, Evelyn signalled the rods perfectly, precisely into place. At least she could guarantee the safe, clean, efficient working of her gang. 2 or 3 stoic birds sang through the rain, lashing against the window. Evelyn could hear Dad talking to the milkman, come for his money, at the door. She rolled onto her back, unravelling her arms from the knot she'd made of her fusty bedclothes, and thought it must be about 10:30. Yawning, she stretched her arms above her head and sat up, taking in the familiar set-up of the room she'd slept in since she was a child. Shelves on the wall, one for her, one for Sylvie, the wardrobe with doors that no longer closed, a washstand, jug, basin, half-sized bookcase, shoes, makeup on the dressing table, knickers drying on the back of a chair, a rag rug between 2 single beds. The disquieting sight of the rounded hump of Sylvie's back huddled deep in her sheets. It had been Sylvie's habit, before she met Alec, to languish in bed on weekend mornings, then potter around the house in her dressing gown and slippers until it was time to get ready again for another evening out. Now she was up first, more often than not, never mind whether the previous night had been a late one. She seemed to be in a fever most of the time, almost unbearably cheerful in whatever she was doing, chattering away about Alec, looking back to when she'd last seen him, or forward to when he would next be on leave. The only time she wasn't in a heightened state of agitated happiness was when he was with her. Then she seemed to calm down into a lull of contentment. There was an exchange of goodbyes from the kitchen below, the banging of a door being closed. Evelyn wondered if she should wake Sylvie and check if she was unwell, but if she was, then she would need to sleep. Leaning over, Evelyn moved the covers away from Sylvie's face with one finger and a thumb, but Sylvie's eyes, bloodshot and puffy, were open. She snatched the bedclothes back and up, over her head. "Are you ill, Sylvie?" Evelyn asked, standing away from her sister's bed. In response, Sylvie felt under her pillow and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Tight writing crammed onto every line. Evelyn's heart thumped. She felt sick. She remembered another letter sent from a soldier and hoped this one didn't bear the same sort of news. If it did, she knew it wouldn't be read with the same sense of relief as the one she'd received from Ron.
End of CD 6.